She was worth $3 billion, and she was sitting alone at a table meant for two, watching the door like she actually believed someone worth her time might walk through it. He showed up 12 minutes late, soaking wet, holding grocery store daisies wrapped in plastic, and he had absolutely no idea who she was. That was the problem. And somehow, impossibly, that was also the beginning. What happens when the wrong man walks into the right moment? When a woman who has everything meets a man who has almost nothing, and he's the only person in years who makes her feel like a human being? Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the very end, because this one is going to cost you some sleep tonight. The rain had been threatening Portland all afternoon, hanging low and gray over the rooftops like it had a personal grievance with the city. By 4 o'clock, it finally made good on its promise. Ethan Parker heard it hit the awning above the bakery's front window. That particular drumming sound that meant the evening rush was either going to be very good or very dead, depending on whether people decided a warm pastry was worth getting soaked for. In his experience, it usually was. People underestimated how much they needed something sweet when the world turned cold and wet. He was elbow deep in bread dough when his phone rang the first time. He ignored it. The dough needed another 3 minutes of working before it would reach the right elasticity, a fact he'd learned the hard way after a whole year of loaves that came out beautiful on the outside and disappointingly dense in the middle. Baking had taught him that most things worth doing couldn't be rushed without consequence. His phone rang again. He still ignored it. The third time, his assistant, a 22-year-old culinary school dropout named Marco, who believed deeply in the philosophy that most problems solve themselves, if you waited long enough, leaned around the door frame from the front of the shop and said, "Ethan, it's been ringing for like 10 minutes. It's probably your brother." It's been ringing for 45 seconds. Time is relative when the sound is annoying. Ethan pulled his hands from the dough, pressed his forearm against the counter to avoid touching anything with his flour-covered fingers, and managed to get the phone to his ear without contaminating it too badly. "Daniel, I need you to do something for me." His older brother's voice had that particular quality. Smooth, persuasive, preloaded with the assumption that whatever was about to be asked had already been agreed to. Daniel Parker had made a considerable amount of money in real estate by sounding exactly like a man who expected to get what he wanted. "I'm in the middle of baking." "You're always in the middle of baking." "That's because I own a bakery, Daniel." "Right. Look, I need you to go somewhere tonight, in my place." Ethan wedged the phone between his shoulder and ear and went back to the dough. "No. You don't even know what it is yet. I know your voice when you're about to ask me to do something I won't want to do. What is it?" There was a pause, the kind that meant Daniel was choosing his words carefully, which was unusual enough to actually make Ethan stop what he was doing. "I set up a blind date," Daniel said. 3 weeks ago. It's tonight, and I have a fever of 102. Cancel it." "I can't cancel it. It was set up through a mutual business contact, and if I cancel last minute, it looks..." "Daniel, it looks extremely unprofessional and potentially damages a relationship I've been cultivating for 8 months. Daniel. And the woman coming tonight is not the kind of woman you leave sitting alone at a restaurant, Ethan. She's..." "I have a daughter," Ethan said flatly. "Sophie gets out of school in 40 minutes. I have a bakery that closes at 7. I have 60 pounds of dough that won't proof itself. I am not going on a blind date for you." Another pause. Longer this time. "Sophie can stay at Mom's. I already called her. She said yes." Ethan stared at the dough. "You called Mom before you called me?" "I was working on the logistics. I'm sick, not stupid." "You're both." "Ethan." And there it was. The shift in Daniel's voice, subtle but real, from the salesman to the brother. "I'm genuinely asking you. I know it's a lot. I know you hate this kind of thing, but I can't leave this woman sitting there alone because I screwed up the timing. Just go, explain, apologize on my behalf, have one drink, and leave. An hour, tops. Sophie will be fine at Mom's. You can pick her up after." Ethan looked around the bakery, the pale yellow walls his daughter had helped him paint 2 summers ago. The chalkboard menu he rewrote every Monday in handwriting that had never once looked the way he intended it to. The small table by the window where his regulars sat and drank coffee and pretended they were there for the pastries when really they were just lonely and looking for somewhere warm. He had built this place after his wife left. Not immediately after. Immediately after, he'd spent about 4 months being completely useless to everyone, including himself. But eventually, when Sophie was 2 and he needed something to hold on to that wasn't grief or anger, he'd taken the small inheritance left by his grandfather and turned an empty storefront on Morrison Street into Proof Bakery. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was real, and most days that was enough. He was not a blind date kind of person. He hadn't been on any kind of date in 2 years. The last one had ended with both of them checking their phones more than looking at each other, and he'd driven home feeling more alone than when he'd left. 1 hour, he said finally. Daniel's exhale was audible even over the rain. Thank you. The restaurant is Carver's, you know it? It's on 5th, too expensive. Yes, well, her name is Victoria. Table's under Sinclair. Just go, please. And for the love of everything, change out of whatever you're wearing right now. Ethan looked down at his flour-dusted apron and the plain gray Henley underneath it. Goodbye, Daniel. Well, he picked Sophie up from school in the rain, which she found delightful in the way that only 6-year-olds find getting wet delightful, as a feature rather than a problem. She stood in the parking lot with her face tilted up and her mouth open, trying to catch raindrops, while Ethan held a jacket over her head and attempted to communicate the urgency of getting into the car. Sophie, Soph, kid, car, now. It tastes like nothing, she reported, disappointed. Rain usually does. Let's go. She climbed in, soaked, unbothered. She was at the age where she asked approximately 40 questions per car ride, and tonight's theme appeared to be dogs. Can we get a dog? No. Why? Because we have a small apartment and a bakery. Dogs like bakeries. Dogs like eating things that aren't for them, which would be a problem at a bakery. What if it was a small dog? Small dogs still eat things. What if it was a very disciplined small dog? Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter, who was watching him with absolute earnestness, water dripping from the ends of her dark hair, completely certain that the right argument was somewhere within reach and she just hadn't found it yet. She looked like her mother sometimes. Not always, and it had stopped being painful the way it used to be. But sometimes, in a particular expression or the angle of her jaw, he'd catch a flash of the woman he'd married at 26 and loved the wrong way for the wrong reasons until they'd both run out of reasons entirely. He loved his daughter more than he'd known it was possible to love anyone. That was the other thing that had happened in the aftermath of everything falling apart. He'd discovered that loving Sophie was the clearest, least complicated feeling he'd ever had in his life. We'll talk about the dog later, he said. That means no. It means later. Dad. Sophie. She crossed her arms and looked out the window at the rain. Then, approximately 7 seconds later, can we get a cat instead? He dropped her at his mother's house with a bag that contained her pajamas, her favorite stuffed rabbit, an animal she'd named Gerald for reasons she could no longer remember, and a container of the cinnamon rolls he'd been testing that week. His mother, Helen Parker, was a practical woman in her early 60s who had the same dark eyes as both her sons, and a way of looking at Ethan sometimes that suggested she was tracking something he wasn't saying. A blind date, she said, holding the door open while Sophie ran past her toward the living room. For Daniel. I'm going in his place to apologize. You're going to his blind date? To apologize. Helen looked at him, at the gray Henley, the dark jeans he'd changed into, the jacket that had seen better years. You look fine, she said, which wasn't the same as a compliment, but wasn't an insult either. I'll be back by 9. Take your time. She paused. You're allowed to take your time, Ethan. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, or maybe he was and didn't want to think about it. 9 o'clock, he said, and walked back to the car in the rain. The flower shop on the corner of 4th was still open, its lights warm and yellow against the gray evening. He stopped, which he hadn't entirely planned to do. Showing up to a blind date empty-handed felt wrong, even for an occasion where the primary purpose was to apologize and leave. But the roses on display in the window were $30 a bunch, and something about spending $30 on a stranger felt absurd. He bought the daisies. They were $6, wrapped in plastic, slightly lopsided. The woman at the register didn't comment, which he appreciated. He stood outside Carver's for a moment before going in. The restaurant was exactly what he'd expect from the address. Tall windows, warm interior lighting, the kind of place where every table had a cloth on it, and the menu didn't need to list prices because anyone who needed to ask couldn't afford it. Not hostile territory exactly, just not his. He pushed the door open and went in. Victoria Sinclair arrived at Carver's at 7:02, which was 2 minutes late according to her own standards and 8 minutes early according to the standards of most people she knew. Her assistant, Priya, had confirmed the reservation that morning. She had also sent Victoria a brief biographical summary of Daniel Parker, real estate developer, mid-level success, well-connected in Portland's business community, set up through their mutual contact Gerald Obie, who Victoria trusted to have reasonable judgment about these things. Victoria didn't need a blind date. She was 30 years old, had run Sinclair Capital Group since she was 26, and managed a portfolio that touched everything from commercial real estate to regional logistics networks. Her life contained very little space, and she had organized it that way on purpose. What she had, if she was being honest with herself in the way she rarely allowed, was a loneliness so old and so thoroughly buried under work and competence and forward momentum that she'd almost forgotten it was there until it pushed up through the surface at inconvenient moments. Like at 11 p.m. in her penthouse apartment when the city spread out below her through floor-to-ceiling windows and all that space and light, and purchased beauty felt like living inside a magazine that belonged to someone else. Gerald had suggested the date the way Gerald suggested most things, casually, without drama, over coffee, after a board presentation. "You work too much," he'd said. "You need someone who'll make you laugh." She told him she laughed plenty. He'd given her a look that suggested he didn't believe her. She'd agreed to the date because she respected Gerald's judgment in business and was willing, as an experiment, to extend that respect into this adjacent territory. Now she sat at the table by the window and looked at the door. 7:15 came, 7:18. She checked her phone once. No message from Daniel Parker, and reminded herself that she was, objectively, a woman who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without losing her composure, and therefore sitting at a restaurant table for an extra 18 minutes was not something that should produce any particular feeling. She ordered a glass of water. She looked at the menu. She did not check her phone again. At 7:21, the door opened and a man walked in. He was not what she'd expected. He was tall, a few inches over 6 feet, with dark hair that was wet from the rain and doing several things at once without committing to any of them. His jacket was good, but not new. His jeans were plain. He was holding, absurdly, a fistful of plastic-wrapped daisies from what was clearly a convenience store or corner shop arrangement, and he was scanning the restaurant with the expression of a man who had agreed to do something he already slightly regretted. The host pointed in her direction. He saw her. Something moved across his face, not the usual response she received from men who were about to meet her for the first time. Not appraisal or performance or rehearsed confidence, just a kind of honest hesitation, like he was checking internally whether he was in the right place. He walked over. He stopped at the edge of the table. "Victoria Sinclair?" he said. "Yes." "I'm not Daniel." He said it immediately, which she respected. No preamble, no attempt to ease into it. "I'm his brother Ethan. Daniel's sick. He has a fever. And he asked me to come explain in person rather than cancel, which I think was probably not his best idea, but here I am." He held out the daisies slightly, then seemed to reconsider the gesture and ended up setting them on the table beside her water glass. "These are from a corner shop. They're not great. I'm sorry about that, too." Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the daisies, then back at him. "Sit down," she said. He blinked. "I was going to apologize and go, 'I drove 40 minutes in the rain for this dinner,'" Victoria said. "You can at least sit down." He sat. For the first 10 minutes, it was exactly as awkward as the circumstances warranted. Ethan Parker clearly had no idea what to do with himself at a restaurant like this. He looked at the menu with the expression of a man doing math. He declined wine when she ordered a glass and asked instead for coffee, which the waiter absorbed with professional neutrality. He held the daisies situation had created, they sat between them like evidence, with the particular stoicism of someone who had made a decision and was committed to not revisiting it. "Daniel said you have a bakery," Victoria said, because she'd read the brief and retained most information she encountered. "Yeah, on Morrison Street. Proof Bakery. How long? 4 years. Almost 5. Do you enjoy it? He looked at her as if the question was slightly odd. Yeah, he said. Yeah, it's hard. Margins in food are brutal, and I have exactly 2 employees who I can't afford to pay what they should be paid. But yeah, he paused. I enjoy it. Most people say they enjoy things when they mean they've made peace with them, Victoria said. You sound like you actually mean it. He seemed to consider that. Maybe. I think there's something in baking that I needed when I started it. It requires you to be patient with things. You put something together and then you wait, and you can't force it to happen faster than it happens. I needed to learn that. I was very bad at patience. And now? Medium, work in progress. She picked up her wine glass, paused before drinking. Your brother didn't tell me anything about you, just that he was sending someone. He has the social skills of someone who has never once considered the impact of his decisions on other people, Ethan said, and then caught himself. Sorry, that's honest? He's not actually terrible, Ethan said, with the resigned affection of a younger sibling. He's just extremely focused on outcomes and sometimes forgets that other people are involved in them. Victoria almost smiled. Almost. I know people like that. You probably work with a lot of them. I am one of them. He looked at her, directly. Not the quick appraising look most people gave her when they were trying to figure out how they were supposed to treat her, but actual eye contact, the kind that expected a person rather than a role. Are you? He said. Or is that what you tell people so they know what to expect? The question stopped her more completely than she let show. She didn't answer that question, not directly, but somewhere in the 30 minutes that followed, she stopped managing the conversation and started having it, which was different. He told her about Sophie without her asking. It came up naturally, attached to a story about how he'd learned to make croissants at 2 a.m. because his daughter had seen them in a cartoon and asked for them, and he'd promised before thinking it through. They took 4 months to get right, he said. Laminated dough is basically physics. You have to fold the butter in at exactly the right temperature, or the layers don't form. And now you can make them. Now I can make them. Sophie ate 2 and said they were good, and then went back to asking for cereal, so Victoria found herself laughing. Not the polished social laugh she deployed at events, but an actual laugh, small and surprised. She sounds like a realist, Victoria said. She's 6. She's a realist who also believes her stuffed rabbit might be sentient, so she contains multitudes. What's the rabbit's name? Gerald, Victoria paused. That's my contact's name, the man who set up this date. Ethan stared at her. The rabbit is named Gerald. My mutual contact is named Gerald. They sat with that for a second. That's either meaningful or completely meaningless, Ethan said. Probably meaningless. Probably. But she was still smiling, and it had been a while since she'd done that over dinner. She told him about Sinclair Capital Group carefully, the way she always did, metering out information about her professional life the way you'd enter cold water, watching for the point where the person across from her recalibrated who she was in relation to who they were. It happened consistently. Something shifted when men heard the numbers. They became either competitive or performatively unimpressed, both of which were types of awe, and neither made for actual conversation. Ethan listened to her describe the company. He asked one question. How many people work for you? Directly, about 43. Across the portfolio companies, it's in the thousands. He nodded slowly. That's a lot of people whose paychecks depend on whether you have a good quarter. Yes. Does that ever... He paused. I have 2 employees. When I had a rough month last November and I sat with the books and it was not looking good, I spent a week just sick about what it would mean for Marco and Deb if I had to let them go. That weight. That's what I mean. Do you feel that? With thousands of people? I feel it differently, she said. At scale, it becomes, she tried to find the word, abstracted. That's probably not a good thing. You seem like you know it's not a good thing. Knowing something and solving it are different problems. Yeah. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I know I'm bad at asking for help. I know that every time someone offers to assist with something at the bakery, my first instinct is to say no. I still do it anyway. Why? Because the bakery is the one thing that's completely mine, he said quietly, like he hadn't quite intended to say that. Knowing something and solving it are different problems. He'd quoted her back to herself. Not mockingly, he'd just heard it and used it because it fit. Victoria looked at this man with his wet hair and his corner store flowers and his complete absence of performance and felt something that she hadn't felt in a long, long time, like she was in a room with someone who was actually present. She wasn't sure what to do with that. They stayed until 9, not because either of them said, "Let's stay." It happened gradually, the way that conversations that aren't supposed to be anything sometimes become the kind that neither person wants to interrupt by doing something as ordinary as leaving. He told her about Sophie's mother, briefly, without bitterness, and without the particular story-shaped performance that people sometimes constructed around divorce. Just the facts. Married young, genuinely loved each other for a while, stopped being good for each other, ended it when Sophie was 18 months old because they both deserved better, and so did she. He didn't make himself the victim of it, or the villain. He just described it as a thing that happened and the life that came after it. She told him about building Sinclair Capital from a starting position of no one believing she could. Her father had started the company. She'd inherited a failing shell and rebuilt it into something real by the time she was 28. She described her board meetings without embellishment, the way certain colleagues had expected her to fail visibly and publicly, and the particular exhaustion of always having to be twice as precise and half as emotional as any man in the room. "Do they respect you now?" Ethan asked. "Some of them. The ones who still don't have learned to work around it." "That's not the same as respect." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He looked at her for a moment. "For what it's worth, from the outside, you seem like someone who's very good at being impressive and not great at being looked after." It was such a direct observation, said with such uncomplicated plainness, that she didn't have a ready answer for it. She found that happened with him. He said things that other people danced around, and somehow the directness wasn't harsh. It was just honest. "I don't need looking after," she said, which was the standard answer. "Okay," he said, not conceding, just okay. Most people don't push back on that. "I'm not pushing back, I just didn't believe you, those are different." Outside the restaurant, the rain had settled into a fine mist. The street was quiet for a Friday. He'd paid for the coffee. She'd covered the rest without discussion, which was practical, and they both knew it, and neither made a thing of it. They stood outside for a moment in that specific uncertainty that follows a conversation that neither person knows how to categorize. "Thank you," she said, "for coming, and for staying. Sorry again about Daniel. Don't be. If Daniel had come, this would have been a different conversation." He considered that. Probably more polished. Probably more boring, she said, and she watched something shift in his face at that. Not vanity, just surprise, which was better. "Good night, Victoria." "Good night, Ethan." She walked to her car. He walked the other direction, probably toward wherever he'd parked. She did not watch him go. She got in her car, sat in the driver's seat, and looked at the restaurant's lit windows for a moment. She had not given him her card. He hadn't asked for her number. They had no plan to see each other again. She thought about the daisies still on the table inside. She thought about, "You seem like someone who's not great at being looked after." She started the car. She didn't know, sitting in the dark and the mist outside Carver's restaurant on a rainy Friday evening, that in 9 days she would walk into a small bakery on Morrison Street and upend both their lives completely. She didn't know about the flour and the arguments and the heartbreak still ahead, or the morning that would eventually come when she'd wake up in a place that felt, for the first time in her adult life, like home. She didn't know any of it yet. She just knew that the drive back to her penthouse was going to feel longer than the 40 minutes it took. He thought about it once. Not obsessively. Not the way it happened in movies, where a chance encounter becomes immediately transformative, and the protagonist spends their days replaying every word. He was too tired for that kind of sustained romanticizing. He had sourdough to manage, a 6-year-old school schedule to navigate, and a December supply order that needed to be placed before Thursday, or the vanilla prices would gut him. But once, in the quiet space between closing up on Saturday night and falling asleep, he thought about her, about the things she'd said about loneliness at scale, that abstraction, as if success had processed the feeling until it was manageable but unrecognizable. About the way she'd laughed at Gerald the rabbit. About the fact that she was genuinely, fundamentally interesting, which was not a description he'd applied to anyone in a while, and he was aware that was probably as much a statement about his own isolation as it was about her. He texted Daniel, "Hope you're feeling better. Your blind date was good company." Daniel replied, "You're welcome." Ethan stared at that for a second. Typed, "What does that mean?" Daniel never replied, which was either smug or he'd fallen asleep, and it didn't matter because there was no realistic next chapter here. She was a billion-dollar CEO, and he was a baker on Morrison Street, and that was just the map. He got on with his week. Marco called in sick on Tuesday, which meant Ethan opened alone and ran the front of house himself until noon when Deb came in. He burned his left forearm on the edge of a sheet pan, the same spot he always burned it, because he was right-handed and pulled things from the oven the same way every time and hadn't broken the habit, and covered it with a bandage that was too small and spent the rest of the day mildly irritated. Sophie had a school project due Friday about community helpers. She chose firefighters, which Ethan supported, but she also wanted to write about bakers, which meant Ethan spent Wednesday evening answering her questions about bread in terms a first grader could reproduce in her own handwriting. She asked him why bread had to rest. He told her it was the same reason people had to sleep, so things could happen inside that couldn't happen when you were busy. She wrote, "Bread sleeps so it can grow. Bakers are helpers because they make food for everyone." He read it over her shoulder and felt something in his chest that had no name he'd found yet. Thursday was quiet. Friday was better. And then Saturday morning, the Saturday that made 9 days since Carver's, the bell above the bakery door rang at 10:17, and Ethan was behind the counter explaining to an elderly regular named Mr. Kim that the cardamom rolls were not yet done and could not be rushed when he looked up. Victoria Sinclair was standing in the doorway of his bakery. She was in a long, dark coat. Her hair was down, which was different from the restaurant. She looked, and he registered this with a kind of quiet neutrality that lasted approximately 3 seconds before it stopped being quiet. Like someone who had decided to do something and arrived at the certainty of it before arriving at the destination. She looked around the bakery, at the yellow walls, the chalkboard menu, the small round tables, at Mr. Kim, who was looking at her with the frank curiosity of a man who had long ago stopped caring whether his staring was polite, at the cases of bread and pastries, at the hand-painted sign above the counter that said proof in letters Ethan's daughter had helped paint, and that were, if you looked closely, slightly different heights. Then she looked at Ethan. "This is your place," she said. "Yeah." She nodded once, slowly, like confirming something. "The croissants," she said. "Can I try one?" He stared at her for one more beat. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, of course." Mr. Kim looked between them with the expression of a man watching something he intended to describe later in detail. Ethan put a croissant on a plate. His hands were completely steady, which he found mildly unreasonable under the circumstances. Victoria Sinclair sat down at the table by the window, and that, though neither of them could have told you precisely when the line was crossed, was the beginning of something real. The croissant was objectively very good. Victoria didn't say that immediately. She broke off the end of it the way you'd test something you weren't sure about yet, chewed once, and then sat very still for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. Ethan was pretending to reorganize the pastry case, but was watching her with the peripheral awareness of a man who had put 4 months of failed attempts into that particular item and still had opinions about the result. "These are the ones Sophie requested," she said. "Yeah." And she went back to cereal. Immediately. Victoria looked at the croissant. "She was wrong," she said, and took another bite. Mr. Kim, who had been lingering near the counter far longer than his cardamom roll situation required, made a small sound of agreement that he hadn't been invited to make. Ethan gave him a look. Mr. Kim, unbothered, picked up his coffee and moved approximately 18 inches to the left, which put him closer to Victoria's table rather than further from it. "I'm Kim," he said to her. "Victoria," she said, and shook his hand with the automatic professionalism of someone who had shaken 10,000 hands. Then she paused, seemed to reconsider, and added, "Nice to meet you." "You a friend of Ethan's?" Mr. Kim asked. We've met once, Victoria said. She's, Ethan started. His brother set up a blind date, Victoria said. His brother got sick. Ethan went instead. Mr. Kim looked at Ethan with an expression that contained significant amounts of satisfaction. That's a good story, he said. It's not a story, Ethan said. It's just what happened. Those are usually the same thing, Mr. Kim said, and finally, moved toward the door with his coffee and his cardamom roll, offering no further comment except a small nod at Victoria that managed to communicate both approval and goodbye simultaneously. The bakery settled into its normal Saturday morning rhythm after that. Two women came in for loaves of the honey wheat. A father and his teenage son spent 4 minutes debating the merits of various muffins before the son gave up and the father chose blueberry. The espresso machine needed its usual coaxing at 11 o'clock. Deb, Ethan's other employee, a 40-year-old former restaurant line cook who had moved to front-of-house work for reasons she described only as "my back and my patience both ran out at the same time," arrived at 11:15, took one look at Victoria sitting at the window table with a coffee and the remains of a croissant, and said nothing at all, which was somehow louder than anything she could have said. Victoria stayed for 2 hours. She worked. She had her laptop open for most of it, and a phone call at noon that she took quietly, turned slightly away from the room, speaking in the clipped, efficient shorthand of someone who had learned to conduct serious business in public spaces without advertising the content. But she wasn't isolated in it. She looked up when the door opened. She watched the room the way you watch something you're trying to figure out whether you like. Once, when a small child knocked over a cup, and the mother apologized profusely, and Ethan told her it was completely fine, and brought a mop and handled the whole thing without any visible irritation, Victoria watched that exchange with an attention that had nothing professional about it. When she finally closed her laptop and put on her coat, she stopped at the counter. "What do I owe you?" "Coffee and a croissant is $8.50, Ethan said. She put a 20 on the counter. "Keep it." "That's an $11.50 tip on an $8.50 order." "Your croissants are underpriced." "My croissants are priced correctly for Morrison Street." "Then your croissants are priced incorrectly for their quality." He looked at her. She looked at him. He took $12 from the register and put them on the counter. $8.50, he said. She looked at the change, then at him. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite frustration and lived somewhere in the narrow territory between them. "Fine," she said. She pocketed the change. "Thank you for the croissant," she said, which was a normal thing to say. "Thank you for coming in," he said, which was also normal. And then she left, and Deb immediately materialized beside Ethan with the energy of someone who had been storing a comment for 2 hours and was relieved to finally deploy it. Who was that? A customer. Ethan. She was at a table. She ordered a coffee and a croissant. She is therefore a customer. Deb looked at him with the specific patience of a woman who had raised 3 children and could identify deflection from a considerable distance. "She's very beautiful," she said, in a tone that was making several additional points without actually making them. "She is," Ethan said, because denying it would be absurd. "She's also extremely successful, and she owns a company that is worth a genuinely unhinged amount of money, and she lives in a penthouse somewhere in the Pearl District, so, Deb repeated. So she came in for a croissant. She stayed for 2 hours. People stay. It's comfortable here. Deb picked up a tray and walked away from that conversation with the dignity of someone choosing not to win an argument they'd already won. Ethan went back to work. He thought about it anyway. The following Saturday, Victoria came back. She arrived at 10:40, which was earlier than the week before. She ordered the same coffee, tried the cardamom roll this time, and spent 3 hours at the window table. She worked again. But this time, near noon, when Ethan brought out a tray of something he was testing, a brown butter financier with a bit of sea salt on top, he put one on a small plate and set it on her table without comment. She looked at it. "Testing recipe," he said. She tried it, paused. "The salt is slightly heavy. I know, I can't figure out where in the process to add it to get it lighter. I have no idea how baking works," she said, "but does it matter when versus how much?" "Yeah, if I cut the amount, it'll lose the contrast I want." "Then it's a timing problem." "Probably. She went back to her laptop. He went back to the kitchen. But something had shifted very slightly in the texture of things. The difference between two people sharing a space and two people occupying the same one. He figured out the financier timing 4 days later. He put one aside for her on Friday without deciding to, just did it without thinking, and then noticed what he'd done and felt something uncomfortable pass through him that he didn't examine too carefully. She came Saturday. He gave her the financier. She tried it, and he could see the moment the difference landed. Better, she said. Yeah. What did you change? Added the salt to the butter while it browned instead of on top at the end. She nodded like that made sense even though it clearly existed outside her frame of reference. And what he noticed, what he kept noticing about her, was that she didn't perform understanding she didn't have. She just received the information and filed it honestly. Your daughter named a stuffed rabbit Gerald, she said, which had nothing to do with baking. Does she know about the actual Gerald? The one who set up the date? No. You should tell her, someday. Why? Because it's a good detail. He looked at her. She was already back to her screen. He went back to his kitchen. This was the third Saturday. He was aware it had become a pattern. He wasn't sure what kind. The fourth Saturday was the first time Sophie was at the bakery when Victoria arrived. This was unusual. Saturdays Sophie typically spent at her grandmother's until the afternoon. But there had been a school event the weekend before that had displaced their routine, and Ethan hadn't had time to make alternate plans, so Sophie was behind the counter in a small apron helping Deb count the napkins in a project of somewhat dubious operational necessity that Deb had invented to give her something to do. She was mid-count when the bell rang and Victoria walked in, and Sophie, who performed most life activities at full volume, said, 47, 48, hi, 49, and then stopped counting entirely. She stared at Victoria with the completely unfiltered assessment of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was something people found uncomfortable. You're very tall, Sophie told her. Sophie, Ethan said from behind the counter. She is, though. That's true, Victoria said. She crouched down slightly, not the full theatrical crouch that some adults did with children, performed and patronizing, but just enough to bring herself to a less towering angle. You're very precisely observant. Sophie considered this. What does precisely mean? It means exactly right. Oh, Sophie appeared satisfied. I'm counting napkins. How many? I forgot. I was at 49. That seems like a lot of napkins. It's a bakery, Sophie said, with the gravity of someone explaining an obvious fact. People get messy. Victoria's expression did something complicated. Not quite a smile, and more than neutral. Ethan watched it happen and filed it away without knowing what he was filing. I'm Victoria, she told Sophie. I'm Sophie. My dad makes the bread. She pointed at Ethan. I know. I've had his croissants. Sophie's eyes went wide with genuine alarm. The croissants are good. I told him I didn't like them, but I was wrong. I changed my mind. That's very honest of you. I was going to keep pretending, but Dad says you have to tell the truth, especially about food, because otherwise the baker doesn't know what's actually good. Victoria looked up at Ethan over Sophie's head. He shrugged slightly. That was more or less his actual philosophy. Sophie went back to her napkins. Victoria came to the counter and ordered her coffee. And something about the morning shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single identifiable event, but in the way that a room changes temperature slowly enough that you don't notice until you realize you're comfortable. Sophie interrupted her napkin project 4 more times to tell Victoria things. Once about a drawing she'd done of a horse that she described as very realistic, even though I made it purple because horses are boring when they're just brown. Once to ask if Victoria liked dogs. Once to report that her stuffed rabbit was named Gerald, and he slept in a specific position every night or he got sad. Once, near noon, to bring her a piece of scrap dough that Ethan had shaped into a rough S, baked, and given her to eat, which Sophie had decided should be shared. It's just bread, Sophie told her, but Dad made it into an S. What does S stand for? Sophie thought about this with total seriousness. Sophie, she said, or snake. I haven't decided. Victoria took the bread S and bit off the top curve. I think Sophie, she said. Sophie beamed with the unreserved intensity of a child who has been given exactly the correct answer and accepted it with her whole chest. Ethan, Pretending to wipe down the counter, felt something in his ribcage shift. By the fifth Saturday, Victoria had stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a fixture. Her table by the window had become, without anyone designating it as such, her table. Regulars acknowledged her with nods. Mr. Kim, who appeared every Saturday with the reliability of weather, had developed the habit of stopping by her table to make brief and pointed observations about his week that she received with what Ethan could only describe as patient amusement. Once, he'd been telling her something about his neighbor's tree when Ethan passed by and caught her looking interested in a way that wasn't performed. He asked her about it later. "You actually wanted to know about his neighbor's tree." "He describes things specifically," she said. "I like people who are specific." "He once described a bad pizza to me for 20 minutes. "Exactly," she said. He didn't say, "That's an interesting thing about you." He didn't say, "I noticed things about you." He went back to his work, and so did she, and that was how they kept moving forward, in observation and restraint, building something that neither of them was naming yet. The sixth Saturday, it rained hard. The foot traffic was sparse, and the bakery was quieter than usual, and somewhere around 2 in the afternoon lull that every small food business lives with settled over the place. Deb was restocking, Marco was doing dishes, Sophie was at Helen's, and Ethan found himself at the counter with nothing urgent in his hands for the first time in hours, and Victoria was at her window table with her laptop closed. She was looking out the window at the rain. He poured 2 coffees. He brought one to her table, sat down across from her, which he hadn't done before. She looked at him. "Slow afternoon," he said. "I noticed." She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "Does that worry you? The quiet days?" "Yes," he said, without hedging. "Every slow day I'm doing math in my head. Whether it's a pattern or just a day. Whether I need to cut something somewhere. It's the thing about small business. There's no buffer. Everything shows up in the numbers immediately." "What month is hardest?" "January and February, post-holiday before Valentine's Day picks up. And August, weirdly. People go on vacation and the neighborhood clears out." She nodded. She was listening the way she listened, like she was actually retaining it, not just waiting for her turn to speak. "Have you ever thought about expanding? Expanding how? Second location? Or wholesale? Supplying to restaurants or hotels?" He considered it. "Yeah, I've thought about it." "But?" "The bakery is, I don't know. I worry that if it gets bigger, it stops being the thing it is." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "I built it when I needed it to be something specific, small, real, mine. If I scale it up, I'm not sure I know how to make sure it stays what it is." "Things can grow without losing what they are." "Sometimes. Not always." "What would make you sure?" He looked at her. "Being sure doesn't really happen in this business. You make decisions and find out." Victoria sat with that. Outside, the rain was running in rivulets down the window glass. The street was nearly empty. "I find certainty in data," she said. "Metrics, projections. If the numbers support a decision, I can make it without second-guessing." She paused. "But there are decisions that data doesn't cover. I'm much worse at those." "Like what?" She looked at the rain. "Like this," she said, which was ambiguous enough that he didn't push it. But he understood what she meant, he thought. Like sitting in a bakery on a rainy Saturday when you owned a penthouse in the Pearl District and had 43 direct reports and a company worth more money than Morrison Street would see in a decade. Like coming back 7 times without explaining why. Like whatever this was, which was something, even though they'd agreed on nothing. He didn't push it. They sat with the rain and the coffee and the comfortable weight of all the things they weren't saying yet, and that was enough for now. The 7th Saturday was when Sophie asked the question. She asked it the way 6-year-olds asked important questions, embedded in something else, casual on the surface, with an undercurrent of seriousness the children had before they learned to be evasive about the things they actually needed to know. They were at the corner table, the 3 of them, which had happened gradually enough that Ethan couldn't have identified the exact Saturday when it had gone from Victoria at her table and Sophie somewhere nearby to the 3 of them at a table. And Sophie was eating a small sugar cookie and explaining to Victoria with great authority the rules of an invented game called Cloud Court, the specifics of which changed depending on the week. And Victoria was listening with the focused attention she gave most things,
And the Queen of Cloud Court has a dog, Sophie said, and the dog can talk but only to the Queen and only at night. What does the dog say? Sophie considered. Important things, she said. About the kingdom. Is it a good kingdom? It's complicated, Sophie said, which made Victoria glance up at Ethan involuntarily, surprised by the word choice. He lifted one shoulder slightly. She was a 6-year-old who listened to adults talk. She absorbed things.
Are you going to come back next Saturday? Sophie asked Victoria in exactly the same tone, without any gap. Victoria paused, just briefly. Yes, I think so. You've come a lot of Saturdays. I have. Do you like it here? Very much. Sophie ate a bite of cookie. My dad likes when you come, she said, with the precision of a person reporting an observed fact. He's in a better mood. He made the funny bread shapes last Saturday, and he only does that when he's happy. The silence that followed this had a specific texture. Ethan was looking at the case of bread across the room with the focused attention of a man who was choosing not to be embarrassed, but was doing so through sheer will. Victoria looked at Sophie with an expression that was trying to stay neutral and mostly succeeding. Is that right? She said. I observe things, Sophie said. I know, Victoria said. You told me. Sophie finished her cookie with complete composure. Then she slid off the chair, announced that she was going to look at the sourdough through the window at the back kitchen because she liked watching it bubble, and wandered off with the confidence of someone who had said exactly what she meant to say and was finished with the subject. Victoria and Ethan sat in the aftermath of his 6-year-old daughter. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be, she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the direction Sophie had gone, and her expression was something he hadn't seen on her before, a softness that she hadn't guarded or structured, raw in a way that seemed involuntary. Victoria stopped. Yeah, Ethan said. They both knew he understood what she hadn't finished saying. He also knew, and this was the thing, the real thing that was accumulating beneath all the Saturdays and coffees and croissants and rain conversations. He knew that whatever he was feeling wasn't a whim or a novelty or the simple fact of proximity to someone beautiful and interesting. It was something heavier than that, more considered. The kind of feeling that arrives when you've spent long enough paying close attention to a person that you start seeing who they actually are underneath the surface they present to the world. He saw a woman who had built something remarkable out of sheer force of will and intelligence, and who carried it with a solitude so complete she seemed to have confused it with sufficiency. He saw the way she moved through his small bakery, his particular cluttered, imperfect place, with a quality that had no parallel in the composure she showed everywhere else. He saw how she was with Sophie, not performing warmth, not reaching for it, just allowing it to exist between them without managing it. He was not going to say any of this. He wasn't sure what the rules were here. He wasn't sure there were rules for whatever this had become across 7 Saturdays and one rainy weekday afternoon, and a conversation in a restaurant that had started as an apology and turned into the most honest exchange he'd had with another adult in years. He was careful with himself. He had learned to be. You raised a child alone, and you ran a business that lived on its margins, and you understood, without needing to be told, the cost of reaching for things that fell through. But he looked at her, sitting at the table by the window where she'd sat 7 Saturdays in a row, and he didn't look away as fast as he should have. She turned, caught him looking. Neither of them said anything. The bakery moved around them. The hiss of the coffee machine, Deb's voice in the back, Sophie talking to herself about sourdough bubbles. And they just sat there for a moment in the honest discomfort of two people who were aware that something had grown between them and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. It was Victoria who broke it. Not with anything revealing, just, the financiers are better than when you first made them. I've been adjusting the brown butter time. It shows. And that was it. That was all. They moved back into the normal language of the bakery, practical and contained, and the moment passed the way those moments did. Without resolution, without address, settling into the fabric of everything else. But it didn't go away. The things that are true tend to stay true even when you're not looking at them. What was also true, though neither of them had said it, and both of them had begun to understand it, Victoria's penthouse had stopped feeling like coming home. Not dramatically, not with a moment of crisis, just the accumulation of small contrasts. The specific warmth of a room that smelled like bread and coffee and had a little girl's painted letters on the counter sign. The specific cold of floor-to-ceiling windows over a city that spread out beautiful and entirely uninhabited by anyone who knew what she took in her coffee. She came back the 8th Saturday. She didn't tell herself she was coming back. She just found, on Saturday morning, that she was dressed and heading toward Morrison Street without having consciously made the decision, which was data of a kind she understood perfectly well and had no idea what to do with. She ordered her coffee. Deb made it without being asked, the way you made something for a regular. That was when Victoria realized that she had, without planning it, without any of the deliberate construction she applied to everything else in her life, become a regular. She sat at her table. Sophie appeared from the back with flour on her nose and said, "We're making scones today. Do you know what scones are?" "I do." "They're like biscuits, but British," Sophie said authoritatively. "That's one way to describe it." "Dad says they're forgiving." Victoria looked toward the kitchen. "He says that about the recipe?" "He says that about scones in general, that they don't ask for much. They come out okay, even when you make mistakes." Sophie paused, seemed to consider something. "I think he means something else, but I don't know what." Victoria wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. Outside, the street was dry for the first time in several weeks. Winter was releasing its grip on Portland with its usual reluctance, and the light coming through the window had a different quality than it had in November. She thought about forgiving, about things that come out okay even when you make mistakes. She thought about 8 Saturdays in a row. She thought about the fact that she had not, in the last 2 months, spent a single Sunday dreading Monday, which had been the texture of her life for so long before this that she'd stopped registering it as something that could be different. Ethan came out of the kitchen wiping his hands on his apron. He saw her. He didn't perform surprise, which she'd noticed about him. He received things without choreographing his response to them. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. And somewhere in that ordinary exchange, in the flower on his forearm, in the weak winter sun on the window table, and Sophie's voice from the back asking where the butter was, something became clear to Victoria Sinclair that had been forming for 8 Saturdays without her permission. She was in trouble. Not the kind she knew how to negotiate or quantify or move through with forward momentum. The kind that sat in your chest like the first bar of a song you'd been trying to remember, finally arriving whole. She drank her coffee. She opened her laptop. She stayed until 3:30, longer than any Saturday before. When she left, she said goodbye to Sophie first, then to Deb. Then she stopped at the counter where Ethan was tallying the day's numbers in the notebook he kept for that purpose. Handwritten, which she'd noticed weeks ago and thought was inefficient, and had since decided was actually just how he stayed close to the numbers, literally. "See you next week," she said. He looked up, looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "See you next week." She walked out into the improving Portland afternoon and did not examine too closely what she was feeling, because she was 30 years old and ran a $3 billion company, and she knew perfectly well that the most dangerous thing about being very competent was that it gave you nowhere to hide from the things you couldn't competently manage. This was one of those things. She walked to her car and drove home, and the penthouse, when she arrived, was exactly as she'd left it, immaculate and high and expensive and quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. And she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows for a long time, looking out at the city, thinking about a bakery on Morrison Street, and a man who added salt to butter while it browned, and a little girl who shared her bread and meant it. She didn't have a plan for this. That was new. For the first time in a long time, Victoria Sinclair had absolutely no idea what she was doing. The 9th Saturday was a Wednesday. That was how Ethan would remember it later. Not by the actual day of the week, but by where it fell in the sequence of things. The way certain events reorganize your internal calendar so that time before and after them become their own distinct territories. Victoria texted him on a Tuesday evening. He didn't have her number. She had at some point in the last 2 months sent him a message about a catering question she'd overheard him discussing with Deb, something professional and sensible, and he'd replied. And the thread had stayed dormant and unexamined in his phone, like a door he hadn't decided whether to open. The text said, "I have a board presentation at 9 Thursday morning, and I'm trying to think, is the bakery open Wednesday evenings?" He stared at the message for longer than the question warranted. It was a simple question. The answer was also simple. "We close at 7, he wrote back, "but I'm usually there until 8 cleaning up. You can come if you want." She came at 7:15 when the bakery was empty and the chairs were up on the tables, and the light had that particular quality of a place winding down from its daily purpose. He heard the knock on the glass front door. He'd already locked it, and went to open it, and she was standing outside in a coat he hadn't seen before, darker than her usual one, and she was holding a folder of papers against her chest, and she looked, for the first time since he'd known her, genuinely tired. Not depleted, not falling apart, just tired in the way that competent people got tired when they'd been carrying something too long without putting it down. "Come in," he said. She came in, looked around at the chairs up and the cleaned cases and the lights turned low. "I'm sorry, you're closing. I said you could come." "I know, She paused. "I don't usually impose." "You're not imposing. Sit down." She put the folder on the counter. He put 2 chairs back on the floor, not at the window table, which felt too much like a Saturday echo, but at the small corner table near the kitchen door where he sometimes sat to do his own books. He put on coffee because it was something to do with his hands, and she sat down and opened the folder and looked at it with the expression of someone searching for a thing they already know isn't there. "What's the presentation?" he asked, bringing the coffee over. "Quarterly review plus a proposed acquisition, hotel chain in the Northwest. 4 properties, family-owned, underleveraged. Good bones." She turned a page. "The board will approve it. That's not the problem." "Then what is?" She looked up. "I'm presenting to 3 people who have decided independently that my judgment on acquisitions has been inconsistent since last fall, and they've been building a case for restructuring my decision-making authority. Not removing me. They don't have the votes for that. Just layering in approvals, making the process slower, making me ask permission." She said the last 2 words with a flatness that told him exactly what she thought of them. "I can fight it. I have the numbers. I'm right. And they know I'm right. But fighting it correctly tomorrow requires me to be absolutely precise. And I've been staring at these slides for 6 hours and I can't find the thing that's missing. Can I look?" She slid the folder across the table without hesitation, which he found significant. The absence of any protective reflex. The ease of handing something important to someone she trusted to handle it carefully. He looked at the slides. He was not a business person. He did not have an MBA or an investment background or anything resembling formal financial training. What he had was 16 years of looking at numbers that were directly and personally consequential, and a functional understanding of what a story needed to make sense. "You're leading with the acquisition," he said. "It's the main item. But you said the board has a prior concern about your judgment, so the first thing they're going to bring to this presentation is that concern. And you're opening with data about the new thing, which is exactly the thing they're predisposed to be skeptical of." He turned a page. "What if you led with the last 3 acquisitions and their current performance, before you say anything about the hotel chain?" She went still. "You're not asking for permission on the new thing," he said. "You're showing them what permission looked like the last 3 times you didn't need it. And then the hotel chain becomes the 4th item in a pattern instead of the first item in a new argument." She looked at him across the corner table in the dimmed bakery. "I've been a little too close to it," she said finally. "You've been staring at it for 6 hours. You looked at it for 2 minutes. I don't have the context you have. Sometimes that's useful." She pulled the folder back toward her. He watched her make a small note on the top page. Her handwriting was precise, like her speech, nothing wasted. She stared at the note, then started flipping backward through the slides with a different quality of attention than she'd had before. He drank his coffee and let her work. They stayed until almost 9:30. He didn't clean up the remaining things he'd planned to clean up. He made a second round of coffee and put out the last 2 financiers from the day's case because they'd otherwise get thrown out. She ate one without looking at it and spent 40 minutes restructuring the presentation order in her notebook, talking some of it through out loud, not asking for responses but benefiting from the presence of someone who would respond if something didn't track. Once she said, "Does this logic hold?" and described a 3-step argument about market positioning. And he said, "The middle step loses me." And she said, "Where?" And he pointed at the place in her explanation, and she said, "You're right," and fixed it and moved on. That was all. but it was the kind of that's all that accumulated into something. When she finally put the folder together and stood up to leave, she looked steadier than when she'd arrived. The tiredness was still there, but it had reorganized itself from the formless kind into the directed kind, which was different. "Thank you," she said. "You did the work," he said. "I just looked at it." "That's not nothing." "No," he allowed. "It's not nothing. Not—" At the door, she turned back once. "How do you do this?" she said. "Just be calm in here at night, with everything quiet. It doesn't make you anxious?" He thought about it honestly. "Sometimes, but mostly it feels like the place makes sense, like it's exactly what it is." He paused. "I think everybody needs at least one place like that." She looked at him for a moment in the doorway with the Portland night behind her. "I think that might be true," she said. She left. He locked the door after her and stood in the empty bakery for a minute before he finished cleaning up, and he thought, not for the first time, but with a new clarity, that this was no longer a thing he could describe as simple. She called him Thursday afternoon to tell him the board presentation had gone exactly as she'd restructured it. The vote on the acquisition passed without objection. The restructuring proposal was tabled. "I told you," he said. "You told me nothing. You asked a question." "That's the same thing sometimes." A short pause. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." He could hear in her voice what she wouldn't say directly. The particular relief of a person who'd been braced for a fight and found they didn't need to throw a single punch. He'd felt that once, when a health inspection had come back clean after a week of genuine worry about the ventilation in the back kitchen. Small scale. But the feeling was the feeling. "Good luck with the acquisition," he said. "Thank you. For Wednesday." "Any time." Another pause, brief, waited in a way he noticed. "See you Saturday," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Saturday." He put the phone down and went back to the bread he'd been shaping, and didn't allow himself to think too carefully about the fact that he'd said any time and meant it without reservation, which was not a thing he'd said to very many people in the last 4 years and meant. The trouble when it arrived didn't announce itself. That was the thing about certain kinds of damage. It moved in quietly, wearing ordinary clothes, using familiar voices. Daniel called on a Sunday evening in March, which was now 4 months after the blind date, and 12 weeks into the Saturdays. "I heard Victoria Sinclair has been coming to your bakery," Daniel said. "Where'd you hear that?" "Portland's not that big, Ethan. Gerald Obie mentioned it. He seemed entertained." "Good for Gerald." "Is it serious?" "We're friends." Daniel was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing words. "That's a generous term." "What does that mean?" "It means—" A pause. "She's in a different category than you. I'm not saying that to be harsh. I'm saying it because I know her reputation and I know her world, and her world doesn't— Look, she's a good person, probably. But people like Victoria Sinclair don't end up in Morrison Street bakeries. Not permanently. They get interested in something. They engage, and then their world pulls them back. And you have Sophie to think about." "I know I have Sophie to think about." "Then think about what it does to a 6-year-old when someone she's attached to disappears because it turns out the experiment was over." Ethan was quiet for long enough that Daniel, sensing something, added, "I'm not trying to be a jerk." "You're not," Ethan said. "I know." He didn't tell Daniel to mind his business. He didn't dismiss the argument because parts of it lived in his own chest already. Had lived there since the second Saturday, when he'd noticed Sophie's face light up at the bell above the door and understood the specific vulnerability of that. What his brother had done was give those private doubts a voice and a logic, and that was the thing about doubts. Once they had language, they were harder to put back in the quiet. He thought about it for 3 days. He didn't change anything outwardly. He was still there on Saturday. Victoria came. Sophie ran to show her a drawing she'd made during the week, an elaborate scene featuring Cloud Court, the talking dog, and newly added, a tall figure in a dark coat standing at the edge of the kingdom, which Sophie described as the visitor who comes back. Victoria looked at the drawing for a long time without saying anything, and then said, "She has very good posture," pointing at the figure. And Sophie said, "I practiced." And the morning went the way the mornings went. But something had changed in Ethan, fractionally. A tension he was carrying that wasn't there before. The outside voices arrived in a different way for Victoria. It was her friend Claudia who said it first. Claudia Marsh was 33, worked in finance, had known Victoria since business school, and was one of perhaps 4 people Victoria considered capable of meaningful honesty. They had dinner on a Tuesday evening at a restaurant in the Pearl District, and somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, Claudia set down her fork and said, "Tell me about the baker." Victoria looked at her. "There's nothing to tell. Gerald says you've been going there every week for 3 months. Gerald talks too much." Gerald is delighted. He thinks he engineered a love story, which would be the greatest achievement of his life. Claudia paused. "Is he wrong?" "It's not." Victoria stopped, started again. "It's complicated. Try me. He's a good person. He has a daughter. He runs a small business, and he's genuinely good at it, and he's—" She reached for the word and found it reluctantly. "Honest. In a way that most people I know are not." "But?" "There's no but." Claudia gave her the look she'd been giving her since they were 24 years old, the one that meant "I have known you for 9 years, and you can try to finish that sentence without a but. But we both know you won't." "He's a single father who runs a neighborhood bakery," Victoria said finally. "My world is not compatible. My schedule, my travel, the way my life is structured. I'm in acquisition mode right now, and that means I'm in 3 cities a month. I can't—" "What does that look like? On either end?" "It looks like what you want it to look like," Claudia said. "That's not how my life works. That's how everyone's life works, Victoria. You just haven't wanted something badly enough to make space for it in a long time." She paused. "Or you've been scared enough of wanting it to talk yourself out of the space before you tried." Victoria picked up her wine glass. "You're very confident for someone who just got divorced." "I'm confident because I got divorced. I know exactly what it costs to not say the thing when the thing is sitting right there." Claudia met her eyes. "I'm not telling you to do anything. I'm asking you to be honest about why you haven't." Victoria had no answer for that. Later, alone in the penthouse, she stood at the windows and tried to construct the honest version of the thing Claudia was asking. The reasons she hadn't said anything to Ethan. The reasons she kept going back without naming what the going back meant. She was afraid of being wrong about herself. That was part of it. She had built her entire professional identity on the ability to assess situations accurately and act without second-guessing. And the last time she'd trusted herself emotionally, a relationship 3 years ago that had lasted 8 months and dissolved when the man involved decided her ambition was more interesting as a concept than a reality. She had been comprehensively wrong. She'd believed something was real that turned out to be a version of her edited for palatability. She didn't think Ethan was editing her. That was specifically the problem. She thought he was seeing her fairly accurately, including the parts that weren't particularly appealing, and continuing to look anyway. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't have data for it. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Parker had drinks with a mutual acquaintance who knew Victoria's inner circle, and during those drinks, a passing comment was made about Victoria's reputation for what the acquaintance called enthusiasm cycles, a pattern where she engaged intensely with new interests, professional or personal, burned through them with complete dedication, and moved on when the novelty resolved into something more ordinary. "A serial renovator," the acquaintance said, not unkindly, always making things better and then needing to find the next broken thing. Daniel thought about his brother's bakery, about Sophie, about 4 months of Saturdays and a Wednesday evening, and what Ethan's voice sounded like when he said anytime and meant it. He called Ethan again. "I talked to someone who knows her," Daniel said. "Daniel, I'm not trying to interfere, but there's a pattern. The way she engages with things, and then, where are you getting this? Reliable source. What does reliable mean to you?" Daniel paused. "I just need you to be careful." "I'm always careful. You're careful about the bakery. You're careful about Sophie. I've never seen you be careful about yourself." The call ended shortly after that, but the sentence stayed, the way sentences do when they're accurate in an uncomfortable way. The crack appeared on a Saturday in late March. It appeared, as most damage does in quiet lives, through a series of small things accumulating into one that wasn't small at all. Victoria arrived later than usual, nearly noon, and there was something different in how she moved through the door, businesslike, contained. She'd come from something before this, Ethan could tell by the coat and the quality of her composure, the dressed-for-performance look that she didn't have on the ordinary Saturdays. Board thing this morning, she said, pre-answering the question he hadn't asked. How'd it go? Fine. She sat down. Sophie appeared, said hello, got a distracted but warm response, and drifted back toward Deb. The acquisition is moving. We're in due diligence on the hotel properties. That's good. It's what comes next. She opened her laptop, but she didn't look at it immediately. She looked at him instead with an expression he hadn't seen clearly before, evaluating almost the way she looked at numbers she wasn't sure about. Ethan, can I ask you something? Yeah. What is this? She gestured between them, a gesture that took in the bakery and the table and the 12 Saturdays and the Wednesday and all of it. I'm asking because I'm not sure I know, and I'm better when things are clear. He'd been both waiting for and dreading exactly this question. I don't know either, he said honestly. She absorbed that. But you feel it. Yes. Then why haven't you? She stopped. Because I have a daughter, he said. And the last time I let something matter, it took a long time to get back from where it left me. And I'm not the kind of person who can try things casually. I can't afford the experiment. Something shifted in her expression. Is that what you think this is? An experiment? I don't know what you think it is, he said, and the honesty of it was slightly brutal. You're brilliant, and you run a company worth more money than I'll see in my lifetime, and you have 43 people reporting to you, and you travel constantly, and your actual life... He paused. Your actual life and my actual life are not the same map, Victoria, and I don't know how to put Sophie in the middle of something that might not be able to hold the weight of what's real about both our lives. She looked at him for a long moment. The bakery was busy around them, the comfortable noise of a Saturday morning, and they were somehow isolated inside it. You think I'm temporary, she said. The word landed flat and hard. I think I don't know, he said, and I don't know how to be wrong about it without it costing my daughter. Something closed in her face. Not anger, something quieter and more private than anger, the kind of expression that happened when someone had been cut in a place they hadn't expected. She looked at her laptop. Okay, she said, in the voice she used to end conversations that had reached their boundary. He went back to the kitchen. The rest of that Saturday moved the way Saturdays moved, with all the ordinary requirements of a working bakery on a busy March morning, and he performed them with the competence of 4.5 years of practice, and tried not to track her table in his peripheral vision. He failed at the not tracking. She left at 2 earlier than usual. She said goodbye to Sophie first, then to Deb. To Ethan she said, "See you next week," which was exactly what she always said, and yet something about it felt different, clipped at the edges, like a door left open just enough to not look like it was being closed. The following Saturday, she didn't come. He noticed at 9:30, when her table was empty. He noticed again at 10, at 11, at noon. He did not call or text. Sophie asked at 12:15 where Victoria was. She might have something else this Saturday, Ethan said. Sophie considered this with the seriousness she gave most things. She'll come next week, she said. Maybe, Ethan said. She didn't come the next Saturday either. Those 2 weeks without her in the bakery revealed something about what 4 months had built, which was the problem with allowing something to become a fixture before you'd named it. You only understood its dimensions by its absence. Sophie asked once more and then stopped asking, which was somehow worse than the asking. She had the particular quietness of a child who understood that something had shifted and didn't know why, and had decided to wait it out with as much dignity as a 6-year-old could manage. She still helped count napkins and delivered scrap dough shapes and told Deb about Cloud Court. But the way she looked at the door when the bell rang carried a fractional hope that broke Ethan's heart in a small but very precise way. He thought about what Daniel had said. The pattern. The enthusiasm cycles. The idea that whatever this was, it had been always going to arrive at exactly this, at a woman who built things and moved on, and a man who'd been the temporary warmth of a season she was already past. He thought about what Victoria had said. You think I'm temporary. He thought about the way she'd looked when he hadn't denied it. Not with anger, but with that closed, private expression, the one that meant she'd filed the information and was processing it somewhere he couldn't see. He thought about, you seem like someone who's not great at being looked after, which he'd said at Carver's 4 months ago, which had been truer than he'd known at the time, which applied as much to him as to her, possibly. He was 48 hours into the second week without her when his phone lit up with a message from a number he didn't immediately recognize. He opened it. "This is Claudia, Victoria's friend. I got your number from Gerald because Gerald has no sense of appropriate boundaries. I'm texting because my friend is miserable and stubborn and won't tell you that herself. And I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I just thought you should know." He stared at that message for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the counter and went back to the bread he was shaping because he needed to think, and he couldn't think while looking at words that were rearranging something inside him, and bread required his hands to move in a pattern he knew so well it left the rest of him free. She was miserable. That was the word Claudia had used. Not busy, not unavailable, not moved on. Miserable. He thought about her face in the Wednesday evening bakery, the tired that had been carrying something too long. He thought about the board presentation and the restructuring proposal and the quiet, controlled precision she brought to everything, because the alternative, uncertainty, not knowing, the feeling of being wrong, was something she'd learned to protect herself from with such thoroughness that she'd structured her entire life around the protection. He thought about himself doing the same thing, a different architecture, same foundation. He had the bakery, which was exactly what it was, which couldn't be wrong. He had Sophie, who was exactly who she was, who couldn't be taken. He had built a life that was so specifically defined and contained that the exposure was manageable. He knew exactly what he could lose because he'd counted it all. And then Victoria Sinclair had walked into his bakery on a Saturday morning with no reason and no plan and ordered a croissant and stayed, and he'd let her become part of the furniture. And then when she'd asked him directly what it was, he'd handed her the doubt instead of the truth, because the truth was the part he didn't know how to protect. Deb appeared at the kitchen door. She looked at him, at the bread he'd been working for too long, at his face. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah." She didn't believe him, but she also didn't push it, because she was Deb, and she understood that people arrived at things in their own time, or not at all. "Mr. Kim is asking if you're making the cardamom rolls today," she said. "They're proofing," Ethan said. "He says he can wait. He always says he can wait, and then he comes back and checks 4 times. He's lonely," Deb said simply. "He just wants somewhere to be." Ethan looked at the bread in his hands, at the dough that required patience, that couldn't be rushed, that came out wrong when you tried to force it faster than it was ready to go. He thought about someone who was miserable and stubborn and wouldn't say so herself. He thought about a 6-year-old who'd stopped asking about Victoria, not because she'd stopped wondering, but because she was protecting herself in the only way she knew how. He thought about 2 people who were both, in their separate and self-sufficient ways, extremely bad at being wrong and not great at being looked after. He put the bread down. The cardamom rolls came out exactly right that day, which was not always the case, cardamom being a flavor that could overwhelm everything else if you lost your attention for even a few minutes. Mr. Kim ate one at his corner table and declared it the best of the year, which he said with a frequency that rendered the superlative somewhat approximate, but which Ethan appreciated anyway. The bakery did its Saturday business around him, full and warm and exactly what it was. Victoria's table by the window sat empty, and in her penthouse, 14 floors above a city that spread out vast and expensive and thoroughly unoccupied by anyone who knew what she needed, Victoria Sinclair sat with a cup of coffee she'd let go cold and looked out at Portland and felt the specific weight of a stubborn person carrying a true thing she hadn't yet found the courage to put down. Neither of them was ready to move yet, but something was building beneath the surface of both their silences, the way pressure builds underground that hasn't broken yet. Invisible, patient, entirely inevitable. The 3rd Saturday arrived like all the Saturdays before it. The rain returned. The bakery opened at 7. Mr. Kim showed up at 8:45. Sophie tied her apron and told Deb that today she was going to learn how to pipe the icing on the cinnamon rolls, which Deb received with the calm of a woman who understood that this was going to require more cleanup than the alternative. The bell above the door rang at 9:07. Ethan, behind the counter with his hands in the display case, looked up. The table by the window was still empty. The customer who had come in was a young couple he didn't recognize, tourists, from the look of their uncertainty about the menu. He helped them. He made their order. He made himself stay in the present tense of the morning, in the bread and the coffee and the practical requirements of a working day, because the alternative was an expectation he'd decided not to carry anymore. He was mostly succeeding when his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at the screen, a text from a number he knew. I owe you an honest conversation. I've been having it with everyone except you, which is cowardly. Are you there tomorrow evening? He looked at it. He looked at Sophie, who was very seriously asking Deb to explain the difference between piping tips and why it mattered. He looked at the empty window table. He typed back, I'm here. And then he put the phone in his pocket and went back to work, because the bread didn't wait and neither did the day. And whatever was coming, whatever honest conversation looked like between two people who were both genuinely bad at the same kinds of things, it would arrive when it arrived. He was learning, slowly, that some things couldn't be forced faster than they were ready to go. The dough knew. The sourdough always knew. She arrived at 7:40 on a Sunday evening carrying a paper bag from the grocery store and the specific expression of someone who had rehearsed something and then decided somewhere between the parking lot and the front door to abandon the rehearsal entirely. Ethan had sent Sophie to his mother's for the night. He told Helen it was because he needed a quiet evening, which was accurate enough in its way. Helen had looked at him with the same look she'd been giving him for 32 years, the one that meant she understood more than he'd said and was choosing to respect the gap, and taken Sophie without comment. Sophie had asked, putting on her shoes, Is Victoria coming? I don't know, Ethan said. You should let her, Sophie said with the authority of a person who had processed the last 2 weeks and arrived at a conclusion. Then she picked up Gerald and went with her grandmother and left Ethan standing in the front hall with the particular sensation of having been managed by a 6-year-old. Now it was 7:40, and the bakery was closed and clean, and Victoria was standing on the other side of the glass door with a grocery bag and her coat and the absence of whatever version of herself she usually walked in wearing. He unlocked the door. She held up the bag. Inside, a mesh sack of lemons, a container of powdered sugar, a block of butter, a carton of eggs. She'd also, for reasons he didn't immediately understand, bought a dish towel, still in its packaging, the kind you grabbed from the end-of-aisle display without thinking too much about it. I want to learn how to make something, she said. He looked at the bag. At her. Lemon bars, she said. I looked up a beginner recipe. Claudia said they were forgiving. Claudia bakes? No, but she looked it up on my behalf. He stepped back from the door. She came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The bakery in the evening had its own particular atmosphere. The chairs down now because he'd put them back after yesterday. The case is empty. The light lower than the working day light. The smell of flour and sugar and the ghost of everything that had been baked that week still living in the walls. Victoria stood in the middle of it with her grocery bag and looked around with the expression she sometimes had when she'd been away from the place for a while. Recalibrating to it, taking it in. I'm sorry I disappeared, she said before he could say anything. I needed to think. And I think instead of talking, which I'm aware is not always useful. It's okay. It's not entirely okay. Sophie asked about me, I assume. She stopped asking, he said, which was the more accurate and harder version of okay. Something moved across Victoria's face. Right, she said quietly. She set the grocery bag on the counter. She looked at the kitchen door. Are we doing this? Am I actually learning to make lemon bars? Do you want to? I want to be in the kitchen with you and talk, she said. The lemon bars were the premise. He almost smiled. Almost. Okay, he said. Cool. Come on. The back kitchen of Proof Bakery was not designed for two people who were navigating something emotionally complicated. It was a working kitchen. Stainless steel surfaces, shelving that ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls, the big deck oven, the industrial mixer he'd bought secondhand and named Gerald before Sophie had transferred the name to her rabbit. It was functional and slightly cluttered and smelled like a place where real work happened, which was different from the smell of fancy restaurant kitchens, which smelled like performance. Victoria put on the dish towel as an apron, folding it twice and tucking it into her waistband, which was not technically the right implementation, but communicated the right spirit. What first? She said. Crust. It's a shortbread base. He pulled down flour, the powdered sugar from her bag, salt. The goal with shortbread is not to overwork it. You want to combine the ingredients until they just come together and then stop. Why? Because the more you handle it, the more gluten develops and the crust gets tough instead of crumbly. So restraint is the technique. In this case, she watched him measure. Can I? He handed her the measuring cup. She measured the flour with the careful attention of someone doing a thing they didn't want to get wrong, which he found quietly endearing in a way he wasn't going to say. They worked through the crust in a functional silence that was different from the silences in the front of the house, less managed, more genuine. She asked questions when she didn't understand something and absorbed the answers without pretending to know more than she just did. When she pressed the dough into the pan, she pressed too hard in one corner and not hard enough in the opposite one, and he reached over and corrected it without commentary, just a couple of passes of his palm across the surface. And she watched his hands, the way she watched things she was learning. The crust went in the oven. He set a timer. They stood at the counter and the silence changed shape, became the kind that had something waiting in it. I've been talking to Claudia a lot, Victoria said. About this. About you. I know, she texted me. Victoria looked at him. She did? She said you were miserable and stubborn. A beat. That's accurate. She paused. I'm not angry at her. I know. She looked at the oven. I've been trying to figure out what I was afraid of, specifically, because I know I was afraid and I don't usually operate from fear, and I couldn't understand why this was different. Did you figure it out? Partially. She turned to face the counter rather than him, which he recognized as the posture of someone saying something difficult. It was easier sometimes to talk to a neutral surface than to a face. I've been wrong about people before. A relationship, 3 years ago, that I thought was real and wasn't, or wasn't in the way I believed it was. He was interested in the idea of me, the successful version. When things were hard or I was just tired or not performing well, he didn't know what to do with that. It ended badly. I'm sorry. It was my own error, she said, with the voice of someone who had processed this thoroughly. I mistook attention for understanding. They're not the same thing. No, he said. They're not. And then She stopped. Tried again. You looked at me in ways that felt like understanding, and that was more frightening than the attention because I knew what to do with attention. I've been managing it my entire career. She turned to look at him then. Understanding is different. If you understand someone accurately and they still leave, that's a different kind of loss. The kitchen held that for a moment. I told you something at Carver's, he said, the first night. You said a lot of things. I said you seemed like someone who wasn't great at being looked after. I remember. I've been thinking about how much that was also me describing myself, he said. I've been here, in this kitchen, for 4.5 years, being very good at taking care of Sophie and the bakery and my employees and every concrete thing in front of me, and being, he paused, very careful not to need anything that could be taken. She was looking at him. My wife didn't leave because she didn't love me, he said. It was the first time he'd said anything this specific to her about it, and he heard the slight change in his own voice, the careful neutrality of a person discussing something that used to be sharper than it was now. She left because we were both very young, and neither of us knew how to be honest about what we needed until we'd already done the damage. And I spent, he exhaled slowly, a long time after that making sure I only needed what I could guarantee. The bakery, Victoria said. The bakery, Sophie, my mother's house, Mr. Kim's opinions about cardamom. A very defensible perimeter, she said, and there was a gentleness in the words that wasn't quite humor and wasn't quite sadness. Yeah, he looked at the oven. And then you showed up for the 9th Saturday, the one that was a Wednesday. Yeah, she was quiet. I handed you the doubt because I didn't know how to hand you the truth, he said, which was that I'd already let you in. Somewhere around Saturday 4 or 5, you became, he searched for it, part of how the place makes sense, and I didn't know how to say that without it being something you could use to leave. The timer went off. They both startled slightly, and the honesty of the moment fractured around the ordinary noise of a kitchen timer doing its job, and Ethan turned and pulled the crust from the oven with a mitt and set it on the rack, and Victoria stood very still at the counter. It smells right, she said. It needs to cool before the filling. How long? 10 minutes. They were quiet again. He made the lemon filling, zesting the lemons, which she watched, then juicing them with the old-fashioned citrus press bolted to the side of the counter that had come with the kitchen when he'd taken over the space, whisking the eggs and sugar and lemon juice together with the particular efficiency of someone who'd made this many times. "Can I whisk?" she asked. He handed her the bowl. She whisked. Her form was wrong, too vertical, not enough wrist, and the mixture wasn't incorporating evenly. "Here," he said, and adjusted her angle from behind, his hand over hers briefly to redirect the motion, and she went still for a moment at the contact, the kind of still that wasn't hesitation, but attention. He stepped back. She whisked correctly, and the mixture came together, and she said, "Better?" "Yeah." She kept whisking. He watched the bowl rather than her face, which was an effort. "I'm not an experiment," she said to the bowl. "I want you to know that. I know that's what you were afraid of, that I was in a novelty phase, that the bakery was interesting, and you were interesting, and Sophie was interesting, and eventually the interesting would wear off and my life would pull me back to itself. It's a reasonable concern. It's a reasonable concern about a person who hasn't changed," she said. "And I have changed. Not dramatically. I'm not going to pretend 2 months of Saturday mornings rewired me, but I've changed in that specific way where you become aware that something you didn't have is something you require." She looked up from the bowl. "I don't experience the penthouse as home anymore. I haven't since December. I've been going back to it every night, and it's been feeling provisional, like a place I'm staying while I figure out where I'm supposed to be." He looked at her. "I'm not searching for an escape from my life, yeah," she said. "I've heard that framing from Claudia, from inside my own head. Probably from wherever you got the concern. That the bakery is comfortable because it's simple, and what I'm actually responding to is the simplicity. But that's not..." She shook her head. "I run a complicated organization in a complicated industry, and I'm genuinely good at it, and I don't want to give it up, and I'm not trying to escape it. I'm trying to find something that isn't the job. I've been trying for years, and everything I tried felt like a performance of having a life rather than having one." She put the whisk down. "This doesn't feel like a performance," she said. The filling was ready. The crust was cooled. Ethan poured the filling over the crust and put it back in the oven and set a new timer, Shates. 25 minutes. And neither of them moved from where they were standing, 3 feet apart in the working kitchen, with lemon on their hands and the oven's warmth and the particular quality of a conversation that had arrived somewhere real. "I pushed you away," he said, "when you asked what this was. I handed you the doubt because I was afraid you'd confirm it, and instead of saying that, I said it first. Which was..." He exhaled. "Cowardly is probably the word." "We've established we're both cowardly," she said. "That's practically a foundation." "It's a bad foundation." "It's an honest one." He looked at her. She was wearing a dish towel as an apron and had lemon zest on her left wrist and flour on the sleeve of her coat that she'd either not noticed or decided not to address. And she was looking at him with the same direct attention she brought to everything. Not managed, not performed, just present. "I'm afraid of you leaving," he said. "That's the specific thing. Not that you don't mean it. I think you mean it. But you have a life with a pull to it, and I have a life that's stationary by design, and I don't know how those maps fit together without someone losing their shape." "I don't know either," she said. "I don't have a plan. I've been trying to find one, and I can't, because it's not the kind of problem that has a known solution." She paused. "But I know that the 2 weeks I stayed away were worse than any quarter I've had in 3 years. And I know that Sophie looking at the door is something I'm not willing to cause again. And I know..." Her voice shifted, fractionally, losing some of its precision. "I know that when you explained the salt and the brown butter to me like it mattered, and you showed me how to adjust the financier, and you talked to me about January being the hard month, like I was someone who was going to be there for the January. I felt like I was being allowed into something real." "You were," he said. "Then let me in," she said. "Actually, not the Saturdays and the peripheral version where we keep going to the edge of the thing and not naming it. Actually, let me in." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be felt. "I'm scared," he said, which was not a sentence he said very often to anyone. "I know," she said. "So am I. And Sophie..." "I know about Sophie," she said carefully. "I'm not asking you to stop protecting her. I'm asking you to trust me enough to be worth protecting her with." She met his eyes. I don't want to be the person she stops asking about. I want to be someone she can count on. I know I haven't earned that yet. I'm asking for the chance to. He thought about his daughter putting on her shoes and saying you should let her with the confidence of someone who had already made up their mind about the correct answer. He thought about 4.5 years of learning that patience was a skill you practiced and not a personality trait you either had or didn't. He thought about the brown butter and the salt and the timing. He crossed the 3 feet of kitchen between them. He was not a person who moved quickly through these things. He was not a person who performed gestures. He just stood close enough that the distance was gone and looked at her. And she looked back at him. And the moment had a weight to it that was not dramatic but was entirely real. The weight of 2 people who had taken a long and indirect route to a place they'd both needed to arrive. He kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss that happened in movies. No music, no light-changing quality, no sudden certainty resolving all prior uncertainty. It was the kind that happened in working kitchens on Sunday evenings between 2 people who were both slightly afraid and had decided to be afraid together, which was its own kind of courage. She kissed him back. And then they both stood there for a second, slightly surprised by themselves. "Okay," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "Yeah," he said. She looked at the oven. "How long does the timer have?" He checked. 17 minutes. "Then we have 17 minutes to figure out what we're doing." "We're not going to figure that out in 17 minutes, he said. "No," she agreed, "but we can start." They talked while the lemon bars finished baking. Not a plan. He'd been right that 17 minutes wasn't enough for that, but a beginning of honesty about what the actual landscape looked like, without either of them editing the difficult parts for palatability. He told her about the January fear in specific terms, not the romantic version of a small business struggle, but the actual numbers, what slow months looked like in the books, the month he'd almost missed Marco's paycheck, and what that had felt like in his body. He told her because she was someone who dealt in reality, and the reality of his life was not sanitized, and if she was going to be in it, she needed to see the actual dimensions. She told him about the travel. 3 cities a month was conservative. During acquisition periods, it was more. She had a calendar that operated 16 weeks out, and there were gaps in it, but not many, and she'd learned over years to protect her time fiercely because no one else would do it for her. She told him because he was someone who dealt in patience, and she needed him to understand that her absence was not the same as her unavailability, that she could be 3 cities away and still be present in the ways that mattered, if he trusted that. "I'm not good at asking for help," she said. "You know this about me. I know it about both of us. If I'm in Seattle for 4 days and something goes wrong here, I've been managing things going wrong here for 4 years," he said. "I'm not looking for someone to manage things. I'm looking for someone who comes back." She was quiet. "That's all," he said. "I need you to actually come back, not just Saturday. Actually, consistently, come back." "I can do that," she said, and the directness of it, no hedge, no qualification, landed in the way that simple truths did when they were said by someone who didn't say things they didn't mean. The timer went off. The lemon bars came out of the oven imperfect. The filling had set slightly more on one side than the other, giving the surface a faint tilt that was visible if you looked. He told her it was a common result with home ovens, which had hot spots that professional equipment didn't. She looked at the imperfect surface with an expression that was genuinely unbothered, which he noticed and filed. "Do they taste right?" she asked. He cut a small square from the edge and handed it to her. She tried it. "They taste right," she said. He tried one. They did. "I can't believe I made something edible," she said, in a tone of genuine mild surprise. "You whisked correctly. That's most of it." "I had coaching." "You have a natural feel for the timing," he said, which was more true than the compliment category it sounded like. She'd stopped the whisk at exactly the right moment without being told, the way some people just understood when something was done. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the pan of imperfect but correct lemon bars. Then she said, "Sophie likes lemon." "She does." She'd say she doesn't and then eat 4. "I'll make them again," Victoria said, "with her, if she wants." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to be someone I'm not," she said. "I'm not a baker. I won't pretend to be. But I'd like to learn things here because it matters to you and because—" She paused. "Because the kitchen is the place in this building where you're most yourself. I've watched you in it long enough to know that. I'd like to be allowed in it. You're in it, he said. I know. She looked up at him. I mean going forward. I know what you mean. They were quiet together. The kitchen had the particular warmth of a place that had been used hard and well, and outside the bakery window the Portland night had gone fully dark, and the street was quiet, and there was flour on Victoria's coat sleeve and lemon on both their hands, and the small imperfect square of evidence that this had happened on the counter between them. He reached over and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just took her hand, lightly, the way you took the hand of someone you'd been walking beside for a while and had decided to stop pretending you weren't walking in the same direction. She looked down at their hands, then at him. I'm going to make mistakes, she said. Specific ones I can't predict yet. I'm going to work too much sometimes and forget to communicate and default to fixing problems alone instead of saying I have one. I know, he said. I'm going to get defensive when I feel like the difference in our lives is something you're managing around. I'm going to have trouble asking for things. I'm going to be overprotective of Sophie in ways that might feel like distrust. I know, she said. So we're aware, he said. We're aware, she agreed. Neither of them moved. We should probably tell Sophie something, he said. Not everything, but something. She's 6, not oblivious. She told you to let me in. He stared. She told you that. She texted me, Victoria said. He stared harder. She's 6. She used Deb's phone, Victoria said. The message said, Dad is being stubborn. Come back. An entirely correct spelling, which I found impressive. He put his free hand over his face. She gets things done, Victoria said, and there was a warmth in her voice so unguarded that it moved something in him. Not the word warmth, not the concept, but the actual feeling of it, the real temperature of a person who had decided to stop being careful about being warm. She does, he said. He thought about Deb, who had clearly lent her phone to a 6-year-old on a mission and asked 0 questions about it afterward. He thought about Mr. Kim, who watched everything from his corner table with the attention of a man who had been married for 40 years and understood something about the distance people created unnecessarily between themselves. He thought about his mother, who had said, take your time on a November evening like she already knew what was coming and was giving him permission from the start. He thought about a restaurant on 5th Street and plastic-wrapped daisies and a blind date that wasn't his, and a woman who had looked at him without appraisal and said, sit down, and the croissant she'd declared correctly priced at whatever her opinion was worth. We should wrap these up, he said, meaning the lemon bars, for tomorrow. Can I take some to Claudia? For texting me about you? As a thank you, Victoria said. She deserves the whole pan, he said. Victoria laughed. The real one, the small surprised one that she didn't plan in advance. He had cataloged that laugh without meaning to over 5 months. The way you catalog things that mattered. They wrapped the lemon bars in parchment and then in foil. They cleaned the kitchen the way kitchens got cleaned after use. Not perfectly, not all at once, but the essential things. She washed the bowl she'd whisked in and he dried it, which was such a mundane and specific thing that it felt somehow more honest than anything they'd said. At the back door leaving, she stopped. I want to meet your mother, she said, properly. Not just Helen, who Sophie mentions occasionally. Actually meet her. She'll have opinions. I have opinions, we'll be fine. He thought about Helen Parker, who had looked at him on a November evening and said, you're allowed to take your time, and who had not once since then said anything about Victoria directly, but who, he'd noticed, had taken to keeping a container of cinnamon rolls in her freezer on weeks when she knew Victoria had been at the bakery. Okay, he said. At the front door, he unlocked it and held it open. The street was quiet. A light mist, but nothing like the rain of earlier months. She paused in the doorway. Ethan. Yeah. The things I said about the penthouse, about it not feeling like home, that's not your responsibility to fix. She said it carefully, making sure it landed right. I'm not asking you to replace something. I'm saying I found something I didn't have, and I don't want to lose it because I was afraid to say so. I know, he said. I know that's what you mean. She nodded. Drive safe, he said. I will. She walked to her car. He stood in the bakery doorway and watched her go, which he'd told himself he wouldn't do and did anyway. The mist was light on the street. Her taillights went red at the stop sign at the end of Morrison and then turned and disappeared. He stood there for another moment. He thought about the lemon bars, slightly tilted from the hot spot in the oven, tasting exactly right. He went inside and locked the door and stood in his bakery, his specific, imperfect, entirely real bakery, and felt something unfamiliar moving through him. Not certainty. He was too honest with himself for certainty, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of a person who has walked out onto uncertain ground and discovered it will hold. He turned off the lights. He went home to his quiet apartment and Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator, and Gerald the rabbit sitting in his designated sleeping position on the couch, and the cinnamon roll Sophie had left on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that said, in her irregular first-grade handwriting, for Dad. Also, is Victoria coming back? Circle 1, yes, no. He looked at the sticky note for a long time. He found a pen. He circled, yes. He put the sticky note on the counter where she'd find it in the morning, ate the cinnamon roll standing at the kitchen counter, and went to bed. For the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, he didn't lie awake doing math about the bakery, or running contingency plans, or monitoring the perimeter of everything he'd built, and everything he could afford to lose. He just slept, which was its own kind of answer. The sticky note was still on the counter when Sophie came home from her grandmother's the next morning. She found it before she found Ethan, who was in the kitchen making eggs, and she stood at the counter in her pajamas with Gerald tucked under one arm and read it with the focused attention she brought to important documents. Then she came to the kitchen doorway and held it up. "You circled yes," she said. "I did." She looked at the note again, then at him. "Did you tell her?" "Tell her what?" "That you like her." She said it the way 6-year-olds said things that adults spent months avoiding. Plainly, without ceremony, with the mild impatience of someone who had been watching the long way around for too long. Ethan turned the eggs. "We talked." "That's not the same thing." "Sophie." "Dad." She put the note on the counter with the finality of a person filing something. "I use Deb's phone." "I know you use Deb's phone. She let me. She said sometimes people need a little help." He thought about Deb, who had told him once that her biggest regret from her first marriage was the number of true things she'd waited too long to say. He made a note to thank her and also to discuss appropriate use of employee cell phones with his 6-year-old. "Victoria is going to come back," he said, to the bakery and other places, more regularly. Sophie absorbed this. "Is she your girlfriend?" The word landed with the specific weight of vocabulary that didn't quite fit the architecture of the thing, but was the closest available option. He thought about Sunday evening and lemon bars, and "I need you to actually come back," and her hand in his, and the mist on Morrison Street, and sleeping without running contingency plans. "Something like that," he said. Sophie considered this. "Okay," she said, in a tone that meant she had been waiting for this information and was relieved to have it confirmed, and was now prepared to move forward. She put Gerald on the counter, climbed onto a stool, and said, "Can I have eggs?" "That's what I'm making." "Good." She picked up Gerald and repositioned him on the stool beside her. "Gerald thinks it's good too." Gerald's opinion is noted. She ate her eggs and told him about her evening at her grandmother's. Something about a movie. Something about Helen teaching her to play a card game that Sophie described as very complicated, and also Grandma won every time. Something about the neighbor's dog that had apparently stood at the fence and stared at them for 20 minutes without barking, which Sophie found significant in a way she couldn't articulate. Ethan listened and drank his coffee and thought that this specific and unremarkable Monday morning, his daughter in her pajamas, Gerald on the stool, the ordinary noise of a life, was the thing he'd been guarding. Not abstractly, concretely, this exact texture of a day. And what he understood now, in a way he hadn't fully understood on Sunday evening and was arriving at slowly over eggs and a child's account of a staring dog, was that guarding it and expanding it were not opposites. You could protect something and also let it grow. You could be careful and still open the door. He'd been treating those as mutually exclusive for 4 years. They weren't. Victoria called at 11, between the breakfast rush and lunch prep. "I have Seattle Thursday through Saturday," she said without preamble. "Board walkthrough on the hotel acquisition. I wanted to tell you before Thursday, so it wasn't..." So you knew in advance. He recognized what she was doing, the keeping him informed version of coming back, the small, consistent act of not disappearing without communication. It was exactly what he'd asked for, and she was doing it 3 days after he'd asked, which told him something about how seriously she'd heard him. Okay, he said. How long's the property tour? Full day Friday. Saturday morning, I have a meeting with the family that owns 2 of the properties. They're resistant. They want assurances about staff retention. Are you going to give them? Yes, because I mean them. A pause. I've been thinking about what you said, about growing without losing what a thing is. I think that's what they're afraid of, that it'll become something unrecognizable. I'm going to tell them that's not the plan. Is it not the plan? It's not the plan. Another pause. I'm learning to value certain things about the way places feel. That probably sounds vague. It doesn't, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Sophie got her answer? She did. She wanted to know if you were my girlfriend. I said something like that. Something like that, Victoria repeated. That's a reasonable working definition. I thought so. I'll be back Sunday, she said. If that... Sunday's good, he said. She came back Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. The shape of things shifted over the weeks that followed. Not suddenly, not with any announcement, just the gradual reorganization that happens when 2 lives that have been running on separate tracks begin, cautiously, to share infrastructure. She started keeping a coffee mug at the bakery. Not intentionally, she'd brought a thermos one rainy Tuesday when she'd arrived before Ethan had unlocked and needed something to do with her hands while she waited. And she'd left the thermos on the shelf by the window table and no one moved it. And it became a fixture the way things became fixtures in Proof Bakery, by persistence and the absence of any reason to remove them. Ethan started looking at his Sunday evenings differently. Not every Sunday. She traveled, she had dinners, she had the operational demands of a company that didn't observe weekends, but enough Sundays that he noticed the difference between the ones that had her in them and the ones that didn't. The ones that did were louder, generally. She was not a loud person, but she asked questions that generated responses, and she had opinions about things he hadn't expected her to have opinions about, like the optimal way to organize the bread display case, or whether the chalkboard menu font was working as hard as it could be. The font is fine, he told her on a Sunday in April, when she'd been studying the chalkboard with the expression she gave financial models. The font is readable, she said. Readable and fine are different thresholds. It's a bakery, not a brand campaign. It's both, actually. She turned to look at him. You have regulars because the bread is good. You could have more regulars if the space communicated itself better. You sound like a consultant. I run a company. Same skill set. She held up a hand before he could respond. I'm not trying to change it. I'm saying there's a conversation worth having. He didn't have the conversation that day, but he had it 3 weeks later when the health inspector came, and one of the things noted, not a violation, just a note, was that the signage for the allergen information was difficult to locate. Victoria had been right that the communication of the space had room to grow. He updated the display, moved the allergen signs, and while he was at it, asked his friend who did graphic design to look at the chalkboard situation. The new chalkboard went up in May. It was the same information, the same menu, the same bakery. The font was different. 3 regulars commented that the place felt different somehow without being able to say why. Mr. Kim said it looked like they'd cleaned something. Ethan counted that as a win. He told Victoria over the phone from Seattle. She laughed and said, "You'll never admit I was right." The graphic designer was right. The graphic designer agreed with me. That's different. It really isn't, she said, and he could hear the smile in it, the ease that had built between them over months of this. The comfortable friction of 2 people who were both certain of things and had learned to argue about the small ones because the large ones they'd already agreed on. Helen Parker met Victoria in late April. This happened at dinner at Helen's house, which Ethan had arranged with the specific care of a man who understood that his mother was going to form an opinion regardless, and he'd rather be present for it. He'd told Victoria, "She'll be direct." Victoria had said, "I prefer direct." He'd said, "She may be direct about things you find personal." Victoria had paused and said, "Then I'll be direct back." Helen made pot roast, which was her standard expression of domestic seriousness. Victoria brought wine, which she'd selected after texting Claudia, who'd texted her sommelier, which was a level of due diligence Ethan found both endearing and faintly absurd. Sophie was there, which helped. Sophie's presence converted most social situations into something manageable because she had the gift of assuming everyone was going to get along and behaving accordingly, which created a pressure to meet the expectation. She sat next to Victoria at the table and spent most of dinner explaining Cloud Court's current political situation, which had developed significantly since winter and now involved a disputed election among the cloud animals. "Who won?" Helen asked, setting down her fork with the focused attention of a woman who took narrative seriously. "It's complicated," Sophie said. "The elephant says he won, but the owl counted the votes and she says the crow did, and I haven't decided yet." "The owl counted them," Helen said. "I'd go with the owl." "But what if the owl is wrong?" "Then you recount. But you start with the owl because the owl did the work." Sophie considered this with great seriousness. "That's fair," she said. Victoria, across the table, was watching Helen with an expression that was measuring something, not with suspicion, but with genuine attention, the way she watched people who said things worth hearing. After dinner, while Sophie helped, or enthusiastically claimed to help, with the dishes in the kitchen, Helen and Victoria sat at the dining room table with their wine and the particular atmosphere of two adults who had agreed, without saying so, to be honest with each other. "You're not what I expected," Helen said. "What did you expect?" "Something more intimidating," Helen said. "Ethan described your company and your—" She searched for it. "Your scope. I expected you to feel it more in a room." "I work hard not to feel like it in rooms," Victoria said. "It tends to stop people from saying what they actually think." "Does it work?" "Mostly. You don't seem particularly stopped." Helen smiled. It was Ethan's smile. The same dry quality, the same place in the face. "I've been a mother for 34 years. I've developed an immunity to intimidating." She turned her wine glass. "He's been careful since the divorce. I don't say that as a warning. I just want you to know I've watched him be careful for 4 years, and it's been the right thing for that time. But careful has a cost too." "I know," Victoria said. "He told me." "He told you about the divorce? Not all of it?" "Enough." Helen looked at her. "Do you know what you're taking on? Not the bakery, not the schedule logistics, the actual person." "I know he's stubborn," Victoria said. "I know he deflects with practicality when he's feeling something he hasn't processed yet. I know he defaults to competence when he's afraid, which means sometimes you can't tell the difference between him being fine and him managing something alone." She paused. "I know that about him, and I'm aware that I do versions of the same thing. We are, between us, a fairly comprehensive study in emotional avoidance." Helen was quiet for a moment. "That's very specific," she said. "I pay attention to people I care about," Victoria said. Another pause. Helen looked at the kitchen door through which Sophie's voice was audible, narrating something to Ethan about the correct way to stack plates, which was apparently not the way Ethan was doing it. "She's already attached to you," Helen said. "You understand what that means in terms of what you owe her." "I understand exactly what it means," Victoria said, "and the directness of it. No softening, no deflection, just clear acknowledgement of the weight." Seemed to satisfy something in Helen that had been waiting to be satisfied. "Good," Helen said. Ethan came out of the kitchen with Sophie on his back, informing him that she'd decided to be a barnacle for the remainder of the evening, which he was accepting with the resigned competence of a man 4 years into this particular kind of transportation. He looked at his mother and Victoria at the table. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine," Helen said. "Good," Victoria said. They were both telling the truth, which he recognized because he knew both of them well enough by now to hear the difference. Summer arrived in Portland the way Portland summer always arrived, later than everywhere else and more beautiful for the waiting, the gray finally releasing into the long, slow, warm evenings that made the city feel like a different place entirely. The hotel acquisition closed in June. Victoria flew to Seattle for the signing and texted Ethan a photo of the paperwork from the conference room. A wide shot, the 4 properties documents spread across the table, the family owners on one side and Victoria's team on the other, everyone looking slightly exhausted and cautiously satisfied. He texted back, "The owl did the work, did the..." She replied with a single laughing emoji and then, 3 minutes later, "Back Thursday. Can Sophie and I make lemon bars?" He showed Sophie the text. Sophie, who was eating cereal and had Gerald propped against the bowl, read it and said, "Tell her yes. Tell her I want to learn the crust part." He typed, "She wants to learn the crust. Thursday's good." They made lemon bars on Thursday evening. It was louder than the Sunday evening version. Sophie narrated the entire process, corrected Victoria's whisking form based on things Ethan had told her weeks earlier, and at one point got powdered sugar on Victoria's coat, which Sophie found funnier than the situation technically warranted. Victoria looked at the powdered sugar and then at Sophie and said, "You did that on purpose." "I didn't," Sophie said, with the specific quality of someone who absolutely had. "Sophie," Ethan said. "It was an accident," Sophie said. "Mostly." Victoria took a dish towel. She had her own now, a proper one she'd bought to replace the packaging plastic version from the first night, which hung on a hook by the back kitchen door, and which Marco had been told, very clearly, was not a communal towel, and wiped the powder off without particular drama. And Sophie, reading the non-reaction correctly, giggled and went back to whisking. Ethan watched this from the other side of the kitchen. He watched Victoria talk Sophie through the crust, patiently, specifically, without talking down or over-explaining, just the right amount of information for a 7-year-old to work with. He watched Sophie take the information seriously because it was being given seriously. He watched them press the dough into the pan together, Victoria's hand guiding Sophie's the way Ethan's hand had guided Victoria's, the same gesture passed forward. He understood, watching it, that he'd been wrong about something he'd believed for 4 years. He'd believed that love was finite, that his capacity for it was already fully occupied by Sophie and the bakery and the specific geography of his constructed life, and that adding anything would require removing something, and he'd been too afraid of what might be removed. He'd treated his heart like a bakery case, fixed number of slots, 0 room for more, without something going on the markdown shelf. What he hadn't accounted for was the thing the actual bakery had taught him every single day since he'd opened it, that the best things expanded without emptying, that sourdough starter, given care and time and the right conditions, produced more of itself, that the basket of bread on the Sunday community table, which he'd started putting out free for whoever needed it, a practice he'd begun the first winter and maintained without announcement ever since, never made the week's earnings worse. That feeding something didn't necessarily cost you what you thought it would. He'd learned it about bread 4 years ago. He was learning it about his life now. In July, without discussing it as a decision, Victoria began spending Thursday evenings at the bakery as a standing thing. Not every Thursday, her schedule absorbed some of them, but enough that it had a rhythm. She'd arrive after her last call, usually around 6:30, and help close up or just sit in the kitchen while Ethan did the end-of-day work, and they'd eat whatever he'd been testing that week, and talk about nothing important and a few things that were, and Sophie, if she was there, would install herself between them and hold court about whatever was currently happening in Cloud Court. The Cloud Court political situation had resolved. The crow had been confirmed, the owl vindicated, and Sophie had moved on to a complex foreign policy dispute involving the neighboring kingdom of Storm Shelf, which she was narrating in real time across several weeks. Victoria had become invested enough in the storyline to ask genuine continuity questions, which Sophie received as her due. One Thursday in late July, after Sophie had gone to bed and Ethan and Victoria were sitting at the back kitchen counter with the remainder of a test batch of olive oil cake between them, Victoria said, "I've been talking to my COO about restructuring my travel calendar." He looked at her. "Restructuring how?" "Compressing the out-of-city work into tighter windows. More video for things that don't require physical presence. I've been defaulting to in-person because it's how I built the company, but a lot of it doesn't actually require me in the room." She turned her fork in the cake. "It would give me more consecutive days here." "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. "I want to. I want—" She stopped, organized the thought. "I want the Thursday evenings to not be contingent on whether I happen to not have a Seattle flight. I want to be someone Sophie can put in her weekly schedule without an asterisk." He sat with that. "The business won't suffer. The business will adapt. It's what businesses do when the person running them makes a decision about how they want to live." She paused. "Claudia said something to me last year, that I work too much because I don't have anything competing with the work. That's changed. I'm competing with a $3 billion portfolio." "You're winning," she said simply. He looked at her, The kitchen light was warm and the olive oil cake was good, and there was flour somewhere on her forearm that she'd gotten during the earlier test batch and hadn't noticed. He did not point it out. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you accept the restructuring?" "Okay. I'm glad you're doing it." She nodded, ate a piece of cake. "It's very good," she said. "The olive oil?" "The olive oil and also the conversation." He smiled. She smiled back. It was not a complicated moment. It was just a true one. Daniel came into the bakery in August. He came alone, mid-morning on a Wednesday, which meant the breakfast rush had cleared and the lunch prep hadn't started, and the bakery had its quiet working hours feel. He stood at the counter and looked around with the expression of a man recalibrating something he'd thought he understood. "It's nice in here," he said. "You've never come in before," Ethan said. "I know." He looked at the chalkboard. "New font?" "New font." Daniel ordered a coffee and one of the cardamom rolls and sat at a table, not the window table. That one had a particular gravity now that regulars had begun to respect without comment. He ate the cardamom roll with the focused attention of someone discovering something. "These are genuinely good," he said. "Yes," Ethan said. "I didn't realize—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought you did here. I think I had an idea that it was smaller than this." "It's always been this," Ethan said. Daniel looked at his hands. He was not a man who apologized often or easily, which was something Ethan had known about him for 32 years and had long since made his peace with. But Daniel was sitting in the bakery with his coffee and his cardamom roll and the specific posture of someone who had come somewhere with a purpose. "The things I said about Victoria, the pattern, the enthusiasm cycles." He paused. "I was trying to protect you." "I know. I was also working with secondhand information from someone who didn't actually know her. I should have said that at the time, that I didn't actually know." "You were guessing," Ethan said. "It came from the right place. It caused damage. We sorted it out." Daniel looked at him. "Are you happy?" The question landed plainly, without architecture around it. Ethan thought about it, not performing the consideration, actually considering. "Yeah," he said. "I am." "She's good?" "She's good." Daniel nodded, drank his coffee. "I'd like to meet her properly. She has opinions about real estate markets." "Christ," Daniel said, but he was smiling. "You deserve it," Ethan said. They sat for a while in the bakery that Daniel had never visited, drinking coffee in the mid-morning quiet, and by the time Daniel left, something that had been strained had loosened itself back toward whatever it was supposed to be. Brothers were like that, Ethan thought. The structure was old enough to withstand some significant weather. September brought Sophie's first day of second grade and the first signs of the coming fall, and a night when Victoria came to dinner at the apartment for the first time. Actually, dinner at the apartment, not the bakery, not a restaurant, but the small kitchen where Ethan cooked the things he ate when he wasn't feeding other people. And Sophie set the table with the focused ceremony of someone given an important job. She put out 3 placemats. She put Gerald at a 4th spot and then, considering, moved him to the counter because she said he preferred to observe. Victoria brought wine and a box of pastries from a French bakery she'd been to in Seattle, which she presented to Ethan with the specific expression of someone who had been thinking about how it would land. He opened the box. Beautiful, technically precise pastries. He tried one. It was excellent. "Don't tell Marco," he said. "That you tried a competitor's product?" "That it's this good." She laughed. He put the box on the counter and started the pasta he'd been planning, and Victoria asked what she could do, and he gave her the salad, which was honest rather than polite. She'd gotten good at salad over the months, learned to taste as she went rather than following the recipe like a document to be executed, which he'd told her was the most important thing. Sophie narrated Storm Shelf while setting out the forks. The 3 of them ate at the kitchen table in the apartment, which was not large and was not designed for anyone's version of impressive, and it was the best dinner any of them had eaten in recent memory, which was not about the food. It was October when the idea of the proposal became concrete in Ethan's mind, though the feeling behind it had been building for a long time before he admitted it was a feeling with a direction. He wasn't the kind of person who planned proposals for weeks and orchestrated elaborate scenarios. He knew that about himself, but he also knew that certain things required intention. that you couldn't let the most significant decisions of your life happen the same way you'd let the Saturdays happen, which was by accumulation and avoidance of naming. He thought about it for 3 weeks. He talked to Helen about it, which felt necessary. She listened, asked 2 questions. Are you sure? And then, is she? And when he answered both with yes, she said, then stop thinking about it and do it. He talked to Sophie about it, because Sophie was his daughter and had an established and non-negotiable stake in all major household decisions. Sophie listened to the question, would you be okay if I asked Victoria to marry us? Which was how he'd phrased it because that was what it was, and was quiet for an unusually long moment. Marry us? She repeated. Yeah. Like she'd be... Sophie worked through the vocabulary carefully. Like she'd be my family? Yes. Sophie was quiet again. Gerald was in his usual position on the couch. Outside, the October rain had started, and the apartment had the sound of a place that was warm inside, while the weather made its case against the windows. She already is, Sophie said. Kind of. I know. This would make it official. Sophie seemed to find this distinction reasonable. Will she say yes? I think so. You should make sure, Sophie said, before you do it, so it's not embarrassing. He looked at his daughter. That's very pragmatic advice. I saw it on a show, she said, and went back to her drawing. He was reasonably sure. Not in the way certainty was manufactured, not artificially, not by ignoring the real complexity of 2 lives trying to fit together across different scales and speeds and histories, but in the way that you were sure about things that had proven themselves across time and difficulty and the ordinary hard work of being honest with someone, even when it was uncomfortable. Victoria had come back, consistently, specifically in the ways that cost her something. She had restructured her calendar. She had learned the crust for lemon bars. She had sat across from his mother and been direct when directness was required and patient when it wasn't. She had let Sophie into her life without performing warmth and without manufacturing a role. She had just been present, reliably, and let Sophie decide what to do with that, which Sophie had done, decisively, in the way Sophie did most things. He found the ring at a small jewelry shop on Alberta Street that had been there for 20-some years. Not a proposal-specific place, the kind of shop that sold handmade things, silversmith work, the occasional estate piece. The ring was simple, a thin band with a small oval stone, not a diamond, a pale green that was almost gray, set low so it sat close to the finger. It looked like something that had been made with care and without ornamentation for its own sake. He thought she would like it. He thought it looked like what they were, not spectacular, not obvious, quietly specific. He kept it in the drawer by the register at the bakery for 2 weeks while he waited for the right moment. He wasn't waiting for perfect. He'd given up on perfect somewhere around the 4th lemon bar attempt, when he'd understood that imperfect and right were not the same failure. He was waiting for real, for a moment that belonged to what they actually were. It arrived on a rainy November evening, the exact kind of rain that had started everything, the consistent Portland downpour that drummed on the bakery awning and made the windows run with water and turned the street outside into a mirror of the lights from the shops across the way. A Tuesday evening, after close, the bakery empty except for the 2 of them. She had been working at the counter. She did that sometimes now, brought her laptop and worked at the counter while he did end-of-day tasks, comfortable in the working quiet of the place. And he'd finished cleaning the kitchen and come out to find her with her laptop closed and her hands around a mug of the tea she'd started preferring over coffee in the evenings. She was looking out the window at the rain. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The first time I walked in here," she said, "it was raining, not like this, sideways that first day, but close. You ordered a croissant. I'd heard about them." "From whom?" "From the blind date I'd had at a restaurant on 5th Street, she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. "With a man who brought grocery store daisies and stayed 2 hours longer than he planned." He went to the drawer by the register. His hands were entirely steady, which he noted because he'd expected nerves and found instead the particular calm of a thing arriving at the moment it was supposed to. He took out the small box. He set it on the counter in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "Ethan, I had a whole thing prepared," he said. "I was going to talk about the dough and patience and things coming together in the right time. But it sounded like a speech, and this is... He gestured between them and at the bakery and at the rain. This isn't a speech kind of thing. She hadn't touched the box. So I'm just going to say it, he said. You came back. Every time something pushed against this, you came back. And I stopped being afraid of that somewhere around the time you taught my daughter the correct wrist angle for whisking, which is both a very specific and a genuinely true thing. He paused. I love you. I should have said that before now. I was waiting until I was certain, and the thing I've learned is that certain is not a destination. It's a practice. This is the practice I want. She opened the box. The ring. The pale green stone. Simple, set low, made to be worn rather than displayed. She looked at it for a long time. He watched her face, which was doing several things at once. The precision usually there was gone, and what was underneath was someone who had not expected to arrive here and was arriving anyway. And the arriving was costing her the composure she'd spent years constructing, and she was letting it cost her, which was the thing he'd learned to recognize as the realist version of Victoria Sinclair. Sophie knows, she said. Sophie advised me to confirm you'd say yes first, so it wouldn't be embarrassing. She laughed, the real one, the surprised one, and it broke across the careful, controlled surface of the moment like light through water. She's right, Victoria said. That's good advice. So? She looked at the ring again, then at him. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He took the ring from the box. He put it on her finger. It fit. He'd measured against the coffee mug handle she used most often, which was arguably the most impractical and completely characteristic method available. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him with the expression he'd been cataloging since November of the year before. The real one. The unguarded one. The one that didn't perform anything. Outside, the rain was doing what Portland rain did in November, which was commit fully to its purpose without apology. The street reflected the bakery lights. Somewhere above the awning, the painted letters of the sign, Proof, in Sophie's irregular first-grade heights, now somewhat faded with weather and time, held up in the downpour. He thought about what the word meant in the context of baking. Proof. The period when the dough rested and rose, when all the invisible work happened inside the thing, when you had to wait and not interfere and trust the process you'd set in motion. He'd been proofing for 4.5 years. He understood now that it had been necessary, that you couldn't rush what had to happen in the dark and the quiet before the thing became what it was supposed to be. He'd built the bakery out of the wreckage of a marriage because he needed something his hands could trust. He'd raised his daughter in the flower-dusted light of that same space because she was the best decision he'd made from the rubble. He'd greeted every Monday with the particular determination of a man who had chosen to be fine and was, mostly, fine, and had kept choosing it until fine became actual. And then a rainy Friday evening and a sick brother and grocery store daisies had walked him into a restaurant and sat him across from a woman who looked at him like a person. And she had kept coming back, and he had finally, gradually, with the patience the dough had taught him, let her. The bakery expanded 8 months after the engagement. Not a second location, not a franchise, not anything that would have required it to become something other than what it was. Just a larger production space in the back, which allowed Ethan to take on the wholesale arrangement with 2 restaurants in the neighborhood that had been asking for his bread for 2 years. He turned them down twice before, afraid of the growth. The third time, Victoria had not told him what to do, but had sat with the numbers for an evening and said, "The infrastructure exists. The only variable you haven't accounted for is whether you trust it." He'd signed the wholesale agreement the following week. Marco got a raise. Then Deb. Then Ethan hired a third person, a culinary school graduate named Pilar, who turned out to have a particular talent for laminated dough and whom Sophie decided was wonderful within approximately 6 minutes, which was Sophie's standard evaluation timeline for new people she liked. Victoria's restructured calendar held. There were weeks when Seattle or San Francisco pulled harder than expected, and she came back later than planned. And he'd learned that the coming back was still the coming back even when the timing was imperfect. She'd learned to say when she was overwhelmed instead of just being more efficient at managing it. He'd learned to ask for help with the bakery accounting, which he'd been doing on paper in a notebook for 4 years. And the amount of time he got back was almost embarrassing in retrospect. They got married in April of the following year. Small. The bakery after hours, the chairs put out in the main room, The tables moved, the cases lit from inside, so the pastries made their own low, warm glow. Helen, Daniel, who had met Victoria properly and who she'd immediately begun arguing with about commercial real estate markets in a way that Daniel found simultaneously infuriating and the most engaging conversation he'd had in years. Claudia, Gerald Obie, who wept openly and unapologetically, and said afterward that this was the greatest outcome of any professional connection he'd made in 30 years of business. Marco and Deb and Pilar. Mr. Kim, who came in his best jacket and ate 3 pastries before the ceremony, and said that he had known from the beginning, which Ethan suspected was 90% true. And Sophie, who was 7 by then, who had decided several months prior that she wanted to be in charge of the rings, and had taken this responsibility with the gravity it deserved, carrying them in a small wooden box that Ethan had made for her at a woodworking class he'd taken specifically because she'd asked him to. The box slightly uneven on one side because he was a baker and not a woodworker, which Sophie had declared made it more special. She stood next to her father and delivered the rings at exactly the right moment, with the composure of a person who had rehearsed and was prepared, and was also, underneath the composure, barely containing the kind of happiness that is too large for a 7-year-old's body to hold entirely still. Victoria looked at Sophie when she took the ring, and Sophie looked back at her, and what passed between them required no translation. After, when the evening had wound down and the guests had gone and Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch in her flower girl dress with Gerald tucked under her arm, Ethan and Victoria stood in the empty bakery. The lights were still on in the cases. The rain had started again outside. April rain, softer than November, the kind that made the city smell like wet earth and the approaching of something green. "We should clean up," Victoria said. "Yeah." Neither of them moved. She looked around the bakery. The yellow walls, the chalkboard, the mismatched chairs that had accumulated over 5 years because Ethan replaced broken ones with whatever was available and had never cared about matching, the window table, the coffee mug on the shelf by the window that was hers. "I used to stand in my penthouse and look out at the city and feel like I was watching it through glass," she said, "like everything was on the other side of something transparent. The view was beautiful. I just couldn't get to it." He looked at her. "I can get to it now," she said. He didn't say anything because nothing was required. He just stood next to her in the bakery where it had started and where it had almost ended and where they had, through stubbornness and patience and the gradual willingness to be wrong about the things they'd been protecting, arrived. He took her hand. She leaned her shoulder against his. The rain said what rain says when it comes to places where something has taken root. Outside, Morrison Street reflected the bakery lights onto the wet road, and the sign above the door, proof. The letters slightly different heights, slightly weather-faded, painted by a 4-year-old's hand now 7 years old and still exactly as it had been, held up against the weather the way it always had. Which was the whole point in the end. Not the spectacular version of holding up, not the polished or the perfect or the kind that looked good in photographs, just the real kind, the kind that stays.